I did not make this fanfic, support the author in the link below. Note: this is just a continuation of What If Deku Was a Ghoul from Kasho's channel, watch chapter 1 there. Chapter 1 is in the comment below. Chapter 31. Foggy Clarity. In the hours that followed, news of the latest attack on UA spread across the country like wildfire, each news and media outlet swarming the hospital and school like mosquitoes, desperate for that new piece of inside information to leak out into the public. When the remaining students had settled as much as the traumatic situation would allow them, both Nezu and Aizawa agreed that no one else in Class 1 or B was to be made aware of who Midoriya was. Formally addressing them that they were not to give any information out on the attack during the night to anyone, parent, carer or media alike, covering the ground they needed to protect, whether the students knew all of the truths revealed tonight or not. Their note of discretion was enforced by members of the police and Detective Tsukauchi alike, working together to ensure the students of UA were aware of the consequences of leaking confidential information. Much to Aizawa's relief, none of the students had any hesitation agreeing to the terms set out by the police, thankfully that the few who were left understood how dire and grim the situation was, even if it was just a threat of being arrested, at least that was a small load off his mind. For now, he had other things to worry about. The hospital was bustling with staff and patients, doctors sprinting around as they rushed to rooms they were needed in. Aizawa could only wince at the chaos that had happened late last night into the morning as he arrived at the hospital, his students getting rushed to the ICU, and Uraraka's pale body getting pulled straight into the emergency room for surgery. He could remember seeing the blood transfusion bags hanging off the side of her bed, the sight itself leaving him fretting fearfully with worry. Her surgery was long and grueling, the emergency light flickering above her room for over 5 hours before it had flicked off, allowing himself, Nezu, Detective Tsukauchi, and Todoroki in to check on her as she laid unconscious in her bed. Giving them a chance to discuss the topic which they couldn't afford to hold off for any longer. Aizawa and Nezu sat down in the 2 chairs beside the wall, Tsukauchi deciding to stand by the door as he listened in silently as Shoto sat in the chair adjacent to Achako's bed, looking over at her worriedly as Aizawa began to ask him questions. Shoto looked down guilty as he slowly turned back away from the bed towards the floor which separated the 3 of them, his expression plain, apart from the underlying anxiety only a hero's trained eye or therapist could see. During the Stain attack, there was a short moment between when he had been eating Stain and when the heroes arrived that I was able to recognize his face. The 2 heroes sat respectfully in silence, listening to the terrors Shoto had faced as his voice shook nervously, revealing them for the first time in full detail since that day, 2 long months ago. My father's quirk had lit up his face just enough for me to see him, but everyone else had been too far away at the time to see who it was before he ran off, and with Iida and Native being unconscious, I was the only one who saw. Aizawa leaned forward on his knees, his voice unusually soft as he spoke, trying to keep the situation as relaxed as it could be. Todoroki, why didn't you say anything while you were in the interview with one of the detectives? Or sat with me in the station? There was no point pressuring and shaming him for holding information now, it wouldn't help anyway. Shoto brought his hands together in his lap as he lowered his head further to them, sighing as he shut his eyes, settling his nerves. At the time, I was scared. In shock? Shoto questioned himself, leaving his teachers to watch patiently as he continued on. I don't really know how to describe it, I couldn't believe what I had seen. Aizawa nodded silently, only the sound of Nisa's handwriting breaking the silence between them as they gave Shoto a chance to pause. I just wanted to know what the hell was going on, I wanted to confirm it for myself before telling anyone. The subtle scratching of pen on paper paused at that as Aizawa sighed simultaneously. Todoroki, I hope you realized how dangerous that was, cornering him like that. Shoto peeked up, offering him a short look of offense to that, not getting a chance to retort as Aizawa continued on. I'm not saying that Midoriya himself is dangerous, we both know what he's like in class, we both know he wouldn't hurt anyone in our class without reason. Aizawa's subtle peeked over to where Uraraka's unconscious body slowly moved up and down with each living breath she took. But going after anyone whose quirk and volatility work against them is dangerous, you couldn't have predicted how he could have reacted, please don't do that again, at least not without backup, alright? Shoto nodded softly, his expression taming itself once he had realized his sensei wasn't treating Midoriya like the villain so many saw him as. I'll do that next time, but I don't regret it. Aizawa could only wince faintly, sighing again as Nezu chose to speak up. Todoroki-kun. Could you please tell us what happened? How he got this quirk in the first place. The hero student eyed them both carefully, internally debating his options before nodding cautiously. He paused. From what he told me, it was his friends. Both the heroes shifted at that, leaning forward subconsciously, intrigued at where this was going. Shadow lifted his head towards them, the seriousness of the situation set on his face as he watched their reactions very carefully. After I had confronted him, he asked me to go back to his house with Uraraka-san. He'd said that one of his friends had tried to kill him, but they had been caught up in an explosion. Shadow furrowed his brows slightly with confusion. I don't really know anything about why the explosion happened. I'm not sure if he knows either. All I know is that she was killed, and because of an injury he had sustained, her stomach had been transferred to him. Nezu nodded, Shadow's words lining up with what All Might had said, as he jotted down some notes. Shadow sighed tiredly, fatigue showing under his eyes as the stress of his friend going missing and the villain attack took their toll. I don't know much of all of what happened. I think Uraraka-san may know more, but… Shadow trailed off as Aizawa spoke up, don't worry about it, kid. Nezu nodded with agreement, it's quite alright Todoroki, you've been a tremendous help. The small mammal offered him an understanding smile, I've just got a few more questions to ask if that's alright. Shadow nodded wearily, causing the mammal's expression to soften before he seemed to delve back into his interrogation mode. Could you tell me how you felt about Uraraka-san going to Midoriya's house too? Do you know how she found out? Aizawa gave Nezu a confused yet weary look as Shadow stilled slightly before slowly answering, looking towards where she laid asleep in her hospital bed. I was shocked to learn she had known about it for longer than I had. She told me that she was in the ruins zone during the USJ attack when she discovered his quirk, but I'm not sure what happened. Shadow thought back to the document that Nezu had written, remembering the notes he had left subconsciously as he spoke the facts that he knew. He wouldn't tell them that he had seen the document though, that would get him into more trouble than it was worth. He didn't notice the way the detective's hand in the corner of the room twitched. Nezu nodded thankfully for his answer as Aizawa spoke up again, do you happen to know what Midoriya has been eating over the last month? Shadow paused with his answer, unsure how to answer as he thought back to the day he and Uraraka had been introduced to Kaneki and Hyde, two of the kindest and wholesome people he had ever met. He couldn't expose them, he couldn't risk another ghoul's future the way he already was trying to save Midoriya. It wouldn't be fair to them after everything they had done for the three of them, for everything they had done to help Midoriya into the happier, brighter person he had seemed to have become. No, I don't know what he's been eating for the last few months. Shadow shook his head as Nezu nodded understandingly, not noticing the detective shifting again by the door. Aizawa sighed, slowly getting up as he moved towards the door. Thank you, Todoroki, even though you're only giving us this information now, it's going to be very useful to us. He offered Shadow a small honest smile as he ruffled his student's hair before turning to leave the room where Nezu and Tsukauchi were standing beside the door. Shadow turned to face Achako, looking sadly down at her still form as a thought rushed through his head. Hey, Aizawa-sensei. Wait. The hero paused at the door along with Nezu and the detective with a questioning hum, MHM? Shadow had gotten out of his chair prepared to chase after them if he had needed to as he spoke. Do you think Midoriya was kidnapped because of something the League wants with him? The desperation in his voice for an answer was clear, the hero's giving him a confused look as he quickly reworded his question clearer. The Nomu, it had multiple quirks, didn't it? I remember. Shadow's eyes widened with fear as he spoke, is that why they wanted him? Because he has two quirks to use him. The trio of adults all stalled at the implications of Shadow's words, Nezu one step ahead as he took a moment to think it all through in the process. They had suspected the Nomu were related to All for One, no one else that they knew of held such power over the average kind of quirk, but they hadn't thought about the possibility of All for One wanting to use the Ghoul quirk for himself. The only theories they had were that the Ghoul had been a part of the League, not that the League was using the League been behind the explosion which had caused Midoriya to have his stomach transplanted in the first place. Why had Midoriya been chosen? What made him special? All for One loved quirks, was it because of One for All? But then that wouldn't make sense, One for All couldn't be stolen. Then it clicked. Midoriya had been quirkless during the explosion, a blank slate. But that couldn't be made public knowledge, at least not without Midoriya's express permission. No, I'm afraid we don't know. The walk down the corridor was held in silence, only the pattering of feet disturbing the peace as the sun slowly began to set through the passing windows. Tsukauchi, did Todoroki lie at any point during that? The detective nodded stiffly, He did a few times. The heroes turned to face him as they paused in their stride, looking at him seriously as he spoke, when he spoke about what Uraraka-san supposedly told him. About her being in the ruins zone, and while telling us that he didn't know what Midoriya's been eating, that too was a lie. The two heroes shared a suspicious look as the detective spoke, unsure of what to make of it. How did he know she had been in the ruins zone if she hadn't told him? Nezu took a moment to think. I'd assume that Midoriya must have told him, since Uraraka saw Midoriya during the attack, they would both have been fully aware of each other's presence at the time. Though, it was an odd way for him to put it. Aizawa nodded while sighing deeply, rubbing the side of his face tiredly. Fuck, I remember seeing how Todoroki reacted after the Stain attack in Hosu. I don't think I want to imagine the amount of trauma she's gone through after seeing what was left of the USJ incident, and even now. Nezu could only hum in agreement as Tsukauchi spoke up again. Nezu, do you have any ideas about what he could be hiding with regards to what Midoriya's been eating? The small mammal nodded clearly, yes, while a little concerning. I don't think it's anything we need to worry about. The detective and Aizawa turned to look a little surprised at that. Wah. Nezu turned to face them as he started walking ahead. If he lied about not know what Midoriya was eating, it seems to me that Todoroki-san doesn't seem too concerned about it. If he didn't feel the need to tell us what he's been eating, then that means they have found some way to sustain him without worry. Tsukauchi looked at him conflictingly. Can we really trust him? I mean, he's already withheld information before. Is it possible that he's doing it again? Todoroki may have withheld information before, but I doubt he will do that again. I suspect he is just weary of the police still and doesn't quite trust us yet. Withholding information from the police is a crime, Nezu. He will end up going to jail if he. Todoroki had lived and grown up under the household of a pro-hero, Aizawa interpreted, a little aggressively as he defended his student's decision. He would know what something needed to be reported to the police when it's best to tell heroes useful information. He's already given us far more information than we previously anticipated and knew before. The hero paused as the detective turned to look a little guilty. Besides, at least if Shoto knows that he's eating, and there've been no reports of attacks on anyone in the last 2 months, it means it's more than likely that they've found someone to help them willingly. Aizawa sighed again, scratching at his head weakly. I haven't got a clue how they managed to do that, thought. Nezu hummed, once we've gotten Midoriya back, we'll have to keep him on a new highly regulated and supervised diet, but I intend to find who's been feeding him. Not just anyone could feed a ghoul their body weight in flesh a month. Agony, that's all he could feel. Running up and down his body in pulses as he flinched at the slightest change of air, his stomach slowly eating away at himself inside out as he laid motionless on the cold cell floor. His bloody arm was held tightly within the grip of his teeth as tears of fear and despair ran continuously from his eyes. All for One had changed his approach once he had realized the power that he was holding, decidedly torturing him to amend the mistake he had made over 100 years ago, each session leaving Izuku writhing with pain. His screams of agony haunting his thoughts as he laid broken on the floor, spasming under torture he had faced after each broken bone he'd been greeted with. The continuous cycle of pain was starting to make him go crazy, wearing him down harsher and violently, each moment of anguish and torment trailing on for longer and longer. Again and again and again crying for help, begging desperately just for the pain to stop, for it all to just end. Pete, please, please just stop it. His sob went unheard, the four corners of the room confining his pleas from the oblivious world surrounding them. He'd felt as if he was truly dying a long, slow, agonizing death. Izuku's stomach growled as he was pulled from his trauma-filled thoughts, his insides burning him alive as the next wave of tears slowly caught up with him, his silent wails only heard by the silverfish and spiders which scattered the bloody floor. He ran his hands through his hair, grabbing at it painfully as he felt the last wisps of his energy fade as his forearm rehealed again, losing count of how often his bones had rehealed. In some ways he felt relieved when the small gaps in between the torture that came, giving him a chance to bite down on his arm and allow the warm, honey taste of his own blood to soak through to his mouth, mutilating his own arms into shreds of muscle, flesh, and tissue. The blood soothing his raging mind as the stumps of his finger and forearms all that was left of his arms, his regeneration slowly starting to shut down. In some ways, he despised the wait, with nothing to do but think about the next time the hard metal door would open, the next time he would be powerless against the agony he would face, and the darkness of death he would crave to consume him. Izuku silently shook the thoughts away, clamping his eyes shut with a whimper as he chewed down harder on his forearm, time blurring together as he tried to figure out what was real and fake. Having passed out each time All for One had finished with him before waking up alone in the stone-cold room he now resided in. How much time had actually passed? Were his friends all right? Had Kaken been saved already? Was anyone even looking for him? Isaacus's sobs grew a little louder as he curled up into himself. No, why would anyone bother after what he had done? He was a murderer, he was a villain. Why would anyone care if he died? All Might probably would, given that Izuku still held One for All. That was the only hope he had of getting out alive. There was no point trying to escape on his own in the condition he was in. Was there even a point of escaping anyway? To be left to rot in prison? Maybe it was just better to let All for One take what he wanted. Maybe that way he would finally be free from the pain and torment he had faced throughout his life. Maybe he could just finally be at peace. God, what was he thinking? Izuku slowly pushed himself off the floor as his thoughts caught him by surprise. How could he even think of doing that? Giving All for One his quirk? Were his will and conviction finally starting to break? He rubbed the weariness from his eyes with the bend of his wrist, avoiding the bloody stumps of his fingers from contaminating his eyes. The taste of his own delicious blood keeping him relatively calm, not thinking about how disgusting it was to cannibalize his own flesh as he tore chunk after chunk out of his arm. At least the flesh he was eating was going straight back into healing his joint that hung limply off his other arm, which he had demolished a little while ago, rehealing just enough so he could switch back without the scars it would create reaching past his shoulders. At least his own flesh tasted nice, soothing, unlike what normal ghouls supposedly tasted like. At least this way he was alive just to give All Might back the gift he never should have accepted in the first place. He shuffled his back up towards the wall behind him, supporting his weight against it as he silently cried, eyes glistening with tears as he looked down at his arms which laid limply above his knees that he'd brought up to his chest for support. Was this all his life was ever going to amount to? He was brought from his depressingly dangerous thoughts at the sound of one of the iron bars on the other side of the door, snapping open, causing him to flinch back with fear at the realization of what was coming through. Isaacus's body froze with terror at the thought of All for One coming to take him, to have another go at torturing One for All from his grasp again when a small figure was thrown onto the solid concrete floor, only a little way away from him. He sat back motionless with fear, not daring to move, as the figure slowly started to push themselves off the floor, only revealing the tame shade of blonde he'd known all his life as they got up and began pounding onto the door with the thick-looking bracelets, which clearly weren't for show, which hung heavily around their wrists. "Oh you fucking bastards, let me out, or I'll blow you all to hell." Izuku didn't know whether to cry from joy or indescribable horror as the dark laughs of someone else came rattling from the other side of the now locked iron doors, locking him and Kaken into the same room, together. Why had they brought him here? Locking him in the same room as him? As food? As bait? The fuming blonde pounded angrily on the door, not noticing Isaacus' petrified, blood-splattered form on the floor behind him. "Hey, I said open the door, bastards." The silent reply left Bakugo's angry punches at the door weakening as his fists began to hurt, only the silence after he had stopped and settled down, alerting him to the sound of someone breathing heavily behind him. Bakugo's form stiffened violently at the sudden sound, turning his head around with fear glazing his eyes as he did so, only to come face to face with the bloody, mutilated, stumpy hands of Izuku staring straight back at him. The only thing Izuku heard was the sharp intake of breath as his classmate took in the sight of him with abhorred horror. Izuku's voice shook with terror, a sad broken smile painting his eyes and mouth as he spoke to his classmate who looked at him with horror, only the sharp intake of breath indicating his reaction to seeing him. Kaken. Bakugo stared in horror at the sight before him, the puddles of blood and missed pieces of flesh scattering the ground as he looked down at the weak frail form of his greatest annoyance, Deku. The two multicolored eyes staring at him with fearful hope as the stumps of flesh and blood which mangled the ends of Midoriya's arms slowly identified themselves in his mind, leaving him frozen with shock, watching the flesh slowly entwine itself back together as it healed. But it wasn't just Midoriya's arms that shook Bakugo to his core with their appearance. His grim smile leaked with blood, which messily smeared across his face, and the light tufts of gray hair which peeked out from underneath the majority of his bloody, matted, green, leaving a less disturbing but nonetheless horrifying sight to see. Bakugo couldn't control himself from letting out a whisper of disbelief. Deku. What the fuck? The once fully green-haired boy let out a choked sob as his eyes looked up to him with a dim sparkle of relief and terror. Kaken. You're alive. Bakugo ignored Midoriya's sob, too distracted by the concerning tufts of white hair which drew in his wide-eyed attention. Deku, what the fuck happened to your hair? Midoriya muffled his sobs as he pulled down on his hair to try and get a better look, utterly confused about what Bakugo was looking at. Wah. Deku, what the fuck's happened to you? What the hell have you done to your arms? What the fuck's going on? His angry persona was quickly starting to break, fear and horror shining through as his panic began to settle in at the state that his classmates' arms were in, leaving Midoriya looking up at him with confusion and concern. Kaken, I what? Bakugo didn't give Midoriya a chance to answer him, his concern quickly being replaced and hidden as he spoke. You've been hiding a lot of shit from me, Deku, you think it's funny, huh? Izuku pushed himself further up into the cold wall, backing away knowing that even though he wasn't bound by quirk restricting cuffs, he wouldn't be able to stop Bakugo from lashing out at him in this state of despair. And no. His voice cut off with shaky wobble, curling into himself as he flinched at the harsh voice attacking him in an attempt to close himself off. Why was Kaken not scared of him? He was hungry. Why wasn't Kaken trying to kill him before the joys of his own blood got too boring for his tastes? When he wouldn't have control over his body anymore? Couldn't he see the monster he was talking to? His yells just seemed to continue on as the mental strain of being locked in a room with his food grew worse and worse on his mind. You've got a lot of explaining to do. Bastard. Bakugo stomps closer towards him, set fear shooting down his spine, causing him to shove his weight down further away down the wall and into the corner of the empty room as he quickly began to have a breakdown. Sobbing loudly as visible drops of salty tears splattered and mixed into the pools of blood below. Okay. Okay. Pete, please stay away from me. Jay, just stay away. Please. I beg you. I promise I'll explain everything, but don't come any closer. Midoriya's sobs of anguish grew louder and louder. I don't want to hurt you. Bakugo seemingly got the message as he froze, realizing that he was facing a monster that would eat him if tempted enough. And with that, he began to explain. There's a villain here called All for One, who wanted my ghoul quirk for himself. I think he was the one behind the explosion which Akuma and I were both caught in a year ago, which caused me to have my stomach replaced. His rapid spluttered sentences were broken by a quick choke. He wanted to take it for himself. His quirk allows people to steal others' quirks. The anger in Bakugo's face once again morphed into horror, no longer switching back as the expression plastered itself to his face. And he wants to take my ghoul quirk. He was using me to make it grow stronger without it merging with other quirks, but… Wait, what? He used you to harvest Akuma's quirk. His face twisted into something doubtful. Why the fuck did he give it to you then? And what the fuck do you mean stealing other people's quirks? That's not possible. Izuku was starting to get desperate, his anger taking over for once. It is. Kaken. Please just listen to me for once. He flinched once he realized what he had said, but with no violent reaction, Izuku continued speaking, not one to try and push his luck with him anymore. All for One wanted to use me to develop the ghoul quirk from a two-eyed ghoul to a one-eyed one much stronger than a normal one for its regeneration and Kagyun. Bakugo sat back stunned on the floor, listening tentatively wide-eyed in silence as he took in the otherworldly information Midoriya was telling him. Someone who could steal quirks. What the fuck? That shouldn't be possible. How could someone like that exist without the world knowing who he was? Was the history from 200 years truly that blurred? How the hell do you even know that All for One exist? How do you know that much about him? Are you working for the League or something? Izuku looked offended, his mouth moving before he could think. What? No. Why would I be locked in a cage, eating my own flesh and blood, if I was working for All for One? All Might told me. As Midoriya spoke, his attention was brought back to the two alternating colored eyes staring deeply towards him, the conversation beginning to get heated, Bakugo unable to control the anger he felt whelming beneath him. What the fuck do you mean All Might told you? And if All for One exists, why do you still have that fucking ghoul quirk, huh? I can see your fucking eye. Izuku jerked back slightly at that, falling into silence as he realized what he had revealed and what he had almost said. He wouldn't be able to get around without lying about One for All. There was no way to get around lying that Bakugo wouldn't pick up on. Izuku sat in silence for a minute, sniffling softly as he rubbed his tear-strained eyes, debating his options. Did it really matter if he told Bakugo about it? They had been trapped in a room with pools of blood scattering the floor, with no windows or fresh air, locked in a cold dank cell together. Was there even a chance of them both getting out of here alive? The longer they spent here, the more exhausted and hunger he would get. If they spent more than a few days here together, he was sure that even if he managed to escape, there was no chance of Bakugo coming out of this in one piece, let alone alive. So would it really matter if he told him the truth? For all of his life he had known Bakugo, and while he was an asshole, he wasn't one for spilling secrets, and well, since everything else about him was in the air, and he was probably going to prison, and there was a good chance they were both going to die. Here alone in this room. Whether they choose to admit it or not, so would it really matter? Did he really have anything to lose? In some ways, he felt guilty pulling Bakugo into this mess in the first place. In some ways, he felt as if he owed it to him after all of the lies he had kept over the years. Maybe this was just his way of making his guilt go away. The part of my quirk which produced a static electricity, it's not part of my Ghoul quirk. He watched motionlessly as he saw Bakugo's eyes widen with surprise. All for One couldn't take it because of the other quirk that I was given called One for All. It can't be taken unless I choose to give it away. Chapter 32. The struggles we face. The luminescent TV screen glowed through the dark, sleepily living room. Kaneki sat back in his favorite seat with a cup of coffee when the tragic news hit the air. 2 nights ago, a group of first-year hero students from Hero School UA was attacked during a summer in the mountainous region bordering western Tokyo. His favorite drink suddenly turned vile. The camp was meant to be situated in a secure location at the Wild Pussycats Mountain Agency, where only staff members having been made aware of the location. Unfortunately, the attack has resulted in the kidnapping of 2 hero students, Bakugo Katsuki and Midoriya Izuku, along with pro-hero Pixie Bob. The china mug of coffee slid from his fingers as his jaw hit the floor, wide-eyed, as the news anchor looked up as images of villains appeared on the screen. Midoriya, his words were laced with fear. 2 villains have been reported as dead at the scene of the attack, including serial killer Muscular, who has involved the deaths of pro-heroes Waterhose and a Nomu similar in looks to the one seen during the Hosu attack and the attack on UA's USJ earlier in the year. Amongst the deaths of these villains, 3 more villains were arrested at the scene, including Himiko Toga, serial killer Moonfish, and Mustard. There have been no other reported casualties from either side as of yet. The news continued on. And on. And on. The League of Villains, who are suspected of being behind the attack, have currently not put out a bargain for the students and pro-hero Pixie Bob's safe return, leaving us currently unsure if the condition either party is in. We'll have more information tonight after UA's press conference. So why do you think the League of Villains chose to kidnap those students too? Well, Sarah, we all know how Bakugo reacted after winning the sports festival in the aggressive behavior displays. I mean, did you see how he behaved while fighting that poor gravity girl during the sports festival? You're quite right, Susan, that is no way for a hero student to behave. Heroes need to be able to save and keep people calm without excessive violence. I totally agree. Which begs the question, did they kidnap them in the hopes to turn them into villains? I sure hope not. We already have enough violent villains running around with the League. We have no need for another unnecessary one. But it does make me wonder, why did they kidnap Midoriya? Midoriya? I haven't the slightest clue. The poor boy didn't even use his quirk during the sports festival. Heaven knows how he got into the finals. Someone who isn't putting their all into becoming a hero shouldn't be in a hero school. There are thousands of candidates who dream of being in the position he is in at UA. Maybe he only went to UA to gather intel for the League of Villains. I mean, why else would they kidnap him unless they were getting a member back? As much as I'd hate to admit it, Susan, that's the only likely observations I've heard so far. Still, you shouldn't claim something like that without evidence. It's immoral. The TV talk show was turned off with a slam. One for all, who? The dreary room echoed Bakugos's words as they sat side by side against a damp wall, the wounds on Midoriya's hands almost completely healed as he gave a weak nod in response, the stench of the blood never really vanishing as the pair of them slowly went noise blind. Yep, that's why All for One hasn't stolen my quirk or killed me yet. I think he's trying to torture it out of me. Midoriya looked down bleakly at the ground, numb to his surroundings, as the feelings of pain and regret swirled around him as Bakugo stared at him ludicrously at his statement. Bloody hell, Deku! Bakugo cursed as he stared at him wide-eyed, I don't know how you have managed to keep a hold of it for so long now. Guess it was a good thing All Might chose and went along with your weak ass in the end. Who? Midoriya nodded weakly, shifting slightly as he took yet another bite out of his arm, the squelch leaving Bakugo squeamishly cringing as he looked away. He swallowed it down whole. If I ever get out of here alive, I'm going to give it back to All Might. I never should have accepted it in the first place. If I hadn't taken it, I wouldn't have been here right now. Midoriya's downright depressing words began to tickle against Bakugo's nerves, irritating him to no end as his classmate continued to verbally beat himself up. Even if you weren't here, I'd still be stuck, idiot. Do you want me to be left here with these stupid villains alone? Midoriya flinched away at Bakugo's sudden accusation, jumping suddenly out of his depressing trail of thought at the sudden change in his blonde-haired classmate's attitude. Who? What? No, Kaken. I'd never leave you here alone. Bakugo sighed with annoyance as he shifted back so his back was against the wall again. Well, good, I'm fed up with listening to your moaning, it's pissing me off, so chill out. Midoriya nodded silently before taking another weary chunk of flesh out of his arm, Bakugo not letting himself look at the state Midoriya was getting himself into again as his arm began to bleed out. We need to find a way out of here, Bakugo spat out angrily, rage simmering as he used his arm to push himself up, off the wall. I'm not going to sit and wait here for those stupid villains to come back and get me. Midoriya looked up at him bleakly. And how are we going to do that? He paused before tilting his head questioningly. Wait, why did the villains kidnap and bring you here anyway? Bakugo looked down at where Midoriya sat with a frown on his face, his voice much calmer than it had been before. They kidnapped me because for some twisted reason they thought they could convince me to switch sides. I told them to fuck and blasted one of them in the face, and when I refused to cooperate, they shoved me through that warp villain and then into here. Midoriya snorted at that, giving himself a small break from the sorrow he felt within. That's why they kidnapped you, haha. Wow, they couldn't have chosen a worse person to convince them to join. Bakugo felt a small smirk grow on his lips at the small sight of what he had known Midoriya to be, before he quickly switched to grimace of disgust as Midoriya ripped yet another piece of flesh from his other arm. I don't know how we're going to escape, and could you stop eating your arm? It's fucking gross, you creepy ass motherfucker. Bakugo let out a sigh of irritation as he dragged his hand through his hair, turning to look away from the state Midoriya was in, as the boy in question just paused and looked guilty down at his arms, grimacing awkwardly as he felt a wave of sadness and grief overcome him. Before looking at Bakugo numbly. God, there's something mentally wrong with you. Bakugo's words were no more than a whisper to himself, clearly not intending for Midoriya to hear the slight edges of his words as he spoke. Kaken, there's been something wrong with me for a while now, but I'm only eating my arms to stop myself from getting hungry and accidentally eating you. Bakugo turned with a jump at the quiet words Midoriya had shared, looking at him with a shocked expression at the confession, the greenette looking up at him blankly. Me eating my fingers is the only thing keeping you alive. With a visible gulp on Bakugo's part, the awkward tension simmered between them as they sat silently on opposite sides of the room, waiting. The only sounds that were occasionally heard were the chewing of someone's food being swallowed. Ichako's vision was blurry when her consciousness slowly crawled back to her, the dull ache and pain in her arm, the first thing she felt as she began to wake up, numbly reminding her of the last memories her mind could remember. Slowly shifting on her arm, letting out a small groan of pain as her arm began to sting, slowly trying to push herself up on her arms as her vision slowly cleared, letting out a small gasp of pain as her wounded arm collapsed under her weight. Oh. You're awake. Ichako let out a small sigh of defeat as she shifted back onto the bed, looking over to the nurse who was fiddling with the IV leads and medications which trailed into her arms, before quickly scuttling over to her to help her sit up, offering her a glass of water as she arrived. Thank you. The nurse quickly yet calmly shushed her as her voice croaked from disuse, taking a small sip from the water before taking the glass from the nurse and chugging the whole lot down her parched throat. The nurse offered her a small smile as Ichako took a small gasp for air, finishing her water as some of it spilled down the side of her cheek. That's quite all right, dear, I just need to inform the doctor that you are awake. Ichako nodded dumbly as the nurse quickly left, still somewhat out of it as her surroundings slowly finished clearing, allowing her to see the medical equipment scattered around the room and the sunlight which shone happily through the window. She rubbed her eyes slowly as she slowly laid herself back down onto her bed, the peace of her surroundings, allowing the fog of memories to cloud her thoughts. Tears slowly pooled in her eyes as she remembered the look of fear and anger which had floated around that night. The scared expression on Aizawa's face just before he had launched himself at the Nomu after tearing at her arm. Ochako took a moment to look below the covers of the scars which covered the top half of her arm, the wound still giving a phantom ache as she slowly moved it to get a better look at the deformed tissue. The same tissue which had given the few of them in the forest the time to escape the Nomu before he was ultimately kidnapped with Bakugo in tow. Oh, Deku Kuny. The sounds of the hospital machinery coming from the room were accompanied by a small choked, muffled sob as she brought her knees up to her chest and hand to her mouth, tears quickly yet silently pouring from her eyes. Why did they have to take you? Her strained whispers went unheard in her empty hospital room, her tears slowed while still silently dribbling from her eyes when the nurse returned with the doctor in tow. The examination didn't take long to go through, and soon she was left to her own devices, the doctors declaring that she was healing nicely and that it would only be a few short days before she was allowed to be released from the hospital, all thanks to the medical miracles of quirk medicine. Even if she would have deformed and dent for the rest of her life, it was much better what state her arm could have been left in all reality she knew she was very fortunate to still have movement in her arm. Still, there was no doubt in her mind that she wouldn't hesitate to do it again. No matter when it was or the reason why, as long as she got to see him again. It didn't take long for her to wallow herself to sleep. The sun setting through the windows, slowly warming her sheets as it dragged her into the world of her imagination, even if she didn't dream that night. When she finally woke up again, her consciousness came back to her far quicker than the first time, her eyes greeting her to the few figures who were sitting beside her bed. Uraraka? Her sensei's voice pulled her from her thoughts as she gave up trying to figure out who the other man was stood behind both Aizawa-sensei and Principal Nezu, slowly using her weak arms to push herself up off of her hospital bed as they introduced themselves. The nurse told me last night that you had woken up, but it seems as if you fell asleep again, since we couldn't have this convocation with you earlier. The hidden intent behind his words didn't go unheard as her eyes began to water. Aizawa-sensei, I'm so sorry. He held a hand out to softly silence her, slowly reaching out to pat the shoulder of the unwounded arm as her face scrunched up with unshed fear and sorrow. Hey, it's all right. Aizawa slowly shifted back as the police detective came closer towards them, settling down in the small hospital chair beside him. But we need you to tell us everything you remember, everything you know, okay? Her sensei let out a small frustrated sigh as he slumped back in his chair. I'll be honest with you, Uraraka. One of the only reasons why you're not in a prison hospital bed is because Todoroki managed to clear some stuff up for us. Otherwise, it would have been far more difficult to convince the police department and heroes in on Midoriya's case not to brand you as a villainous accomplice. Ochako let out a quiet sniff as she rubbed her tired eyes, nodding solemnly before speaking. Aizawa-sensei, it's not Deku's fault. He doesn't deserve to go to prison. Her quite anxious voice quickly picked up in pace as her eyes widened with desperation, new tears slowly dripping from her eyes. He's saved me so many times I've lost count. If he hadn't saved me and the others from the villains in the USJ or the summer camp, we all would have died. Aizawa listened calmly before replying, trying to reassure her as he offered her something of a tired, comforting smile. Give yourself some credit, you're more capable than you may think. His smile dimmed a little as he shifted back slightly in his chair. We'll keep in mind what you've said when we make our reports, alright? Nezu, who was sat contently in the chair beside her sensei, shifted his head as he spoke. We just need you to explain everything that you know about the situation Midoriya has got himself into. Ochako sniffled slightly as she nodded in agreement as Nezu took a moment to pause and offer her a tissue which she took gratefully. We need to know where and what he's been eating, and confirmation on what he's told you about how he obtained his Ghoul quirk to ensure the safety of the rest of the students at UA and Midoriya himself for when he can return to UA. Ochako paused her nod of understanding as his words registered in her head, looking up towards the three men questioning her beside her hospital bed. When? Nezu had said when. It took a little over half an hour for Ochako to explain in length the events of the months since the start of school and the information she had been told about from before they had entered UA High School, answering them in as much honest light that she could set Midoriya in. Detailing the events of the USJ attack and the conversations she had before and after Todoroki had been brought in on their secret. She confessed the amount of worry and concern she had held for him ever since he had broken down before her in his own home, and the considerable change in behavior he had gained over the last couple of months. Failing to mention the confessions of attempted suicides he had mentioned months ago from the year before. That didn't feel like her place to tell, and she wasn't about to reveal her closest friend's past lows to a trio of men who didn't fully trust Midoriya in the first place. She knew how few ways there were for a ghoul to kill themselves, and they'd know just as well. The introduced detective took turns with her teachers asking her questions, Tsukauchi leaning forward to lean on his knees as he wrote down notes in his book. Do you know where he's been getting his food from recently? Achako shook her head with a no, saying almost the exact same thing Todoroki had a day or so ago. No, I don't, sorry I don't like to ask, but I do know he hasn't been starving himself. Tsukauchi nodded as he took another note in his notebook, already knowing that it was pretty clear that a ghoul couldn't starve themselves for 2 months without going on a murderous killing spree or dying alone in some locked closet. Alright, thank you for answering my question. I believe Nezu has one more question for you. He turned to look at the principal who bopped his head with confirmation. That's right. I'd just like to ask you if you'd told Todoroki about where you and Midoriya had been during the USJ attack. Achako furrowed her brows with confusion as she wondered what the principal was on about when she remembered the document Todoroki had access to. Oh, yes. He had been wondering how I had found out about Midoriya Ghoul's quirk. She sounded convincing enough, but Aizawa didn't need to ask Tsukauchi if he should believe her or not. Nezu gave a small hum as he stood upon the chair, grabbing a hold of Aizawa's scarf as the two taller men stood up. Alright then, everything you've said lines up nicely with what Todoroki said, so thank you for explaining things for us, you've helped us tremendously. Nezu offered Achako a small smile as the trio walked out of the room, leaving the girl alone to her devices. So, did she lie at all? Tsukauchi sighed slightly as he rubbed the back of his head and Aizawa's words. Only about the same things Todoroki lied about, unfortunately, it seems as if they both seem to know what Midoriya's been eating. The only other thing was about whether she had told Todoroki what section of the USJ she had been in during the attack, but other than that, everything was registering as true. The principal nodded at the detective's statement, accepting his word. As much as I'd like to know what Midoriya's been eating, we can ask him if we ever find him. What I'm rather interested in is why they both lied about Uraraka-san telling Todoroki about their location during the USJ. Aizawa sighed deeply, the stress that had been pooled deep in his stomach slowly surfacing again. We can find that out some other time. How are we even meant to find where Bakugo and Midoriya were taken without a lead? Nezu lowered his head slightly, that I don't have the answer to unless we. Excuse me. The trio paused at the sound of someone calling out to them, turning around to see a nurse dressed in blue jogging up to them with white and urgent eyes as she directed herself towards Aizawa. Sir, one of your students, Yaoi Rozu-san has woken up and has requested to speak with you. The trio of men looked at each other for a split moment before quickly hurrying after the nurse in the direction of Aizawa's student's hospital room. The Nomu walked past us and Awais managed to use his quirk to attack a tracker I made. The undeniable excitement in her voice from managing to do such a dangerous and would-be very useful thing was clear as she used her quirk to pull out the unfortunately useless tracker. Aizawa sighed slightly as he offered his students a weak smile. The detective and principal stood only a few feet behind him. Thank you, Yaoi Rozu. That was a brave risk you took, but I don't advise you to do something this dangerous without a plan or backup again. His students nodded with a muffled smile as she held out the device towards him, causing him to shake his head regretfully. I'm afraid if you attached it to the Nomu, we won't be able to use it to trace it back to the villain's hideout. Momo tilted her head questioningly as she slowly brought her device closer towards her with hesitation. Aizawa-sensei. Why? What do you mean? The sound of confusion and growing anxiety was clear. The Nomu as the summer camp has been apprehended and is now in the hands of the police department. Aizawa's voice was calm and steady as he spoke, his professional appearance quickly softening as he saw his student lower her head with guilt. Oh okay, I'm sorry I couldn't have been of any help. Aizawa wasn't having any of that, walking up to the side of her bed before squatting down to be face level with his student, speaking calmly as he did. Hey. There is nothing to be ashamed of, even if what you did won't help us in the long run, it was still incredibly brave and incredible use of foresight to do. With that mindset and willpower, I know you, along with the rest of your class will become great heroes, alright. Momo looked at him with a surprised expression and the rare side of his soft side, nodding slowly as tears welled up slightly in her eyes. Okay, thank you, sensei. A little while later, Aizawa stood and ruffled her head a little comfortingly as they walked out of her room, allowing her to recover in peace. What the hell are we meant to do now? Aizawa cursed, his stress about their situation slowly getting the better of him. Nezu hummed thoughtfully, the only option I can think of is interrogating the villains we caught, more so the young girl, Himiko Toga. Aizawa raised his eyebrows wearily, you mean the kid with the knife? Nezu nodded with agreement, she's underage, too young to legally be put into Tartarus yet, and she's still in police custody along with Mustard, while the rest of the villains have already been escorted to their decided facilities. What makes you think Himiko is going to be any easier to get information out of than Mustard? Aizawa huffed out. Nezu paused and turned to look behind him where Aizawa had been trailing behind him, a silent response all that the two taller men got. Toshuki shifted cautiously, you're planning on manipulating her, aren't you? Manipulating is a little strong, I'd say more persuading. The two men sighed exasperatedly at Nezu's innocently sounding words, fully understanding the connotations beneath them. Nezu didn't seem too bothered by their response. Times are ticking and we don't have any leads to find Midoriya and Bakugo. Talking to her may be our only hope, even if it does mean emotionally manipulating or persuading in some way. Nezu turned to look forward as he pulled out his phone and began typing something in. She may be a villain with several murders under her belt, but so doesn't Midoriya? They're both in need of help in some form, no matter what deeds life may have forced them to take. The cell in the police station they had dumped her in was dull and boring, no color, little light, and definitely no red, apart from the few bits of her clothes that they had allowed her to keep after fully searching though for weapons and contraband. All her knives. Gone. And her new kit the League had given her to help with her quirk, even if she didn't like the very uncute mask that came with it. And now she was left all alone in this stupid cell, with nothing but white walls and a mirror on the opposite side of the bed she was sat on. She couldn't smell much either, the airtight door not letting anything through, only the vent on the ceiling, revealing a little of the people who were obviously wandering around outside the station. It was a few hours after they had given her some food that the cell door opened at an odd time, three men walking in behind the heavily armed guards behind masks that she had smelt before. One of the two men and rat thing that had walked in smelt the same as one of the senseis at UA High too. Hello Himiko Toga, the rat man began cheerfully, I am Principal Nezu of UA High. I've been told that you've interacted with a group of villains I've been rather interested in recently. Toga's confused and cautious expression turned as she sneered darkly, quickly catching on to what those disgusting heroes were here to beg for from those few simple words the hero had uttered. We'd just like to know if you happen to know the location of where they had hidden some of our precious students from us. Chapter 33. A Glimmer of Hope. Toga Himiko. The room was silent after Nezu had finished introducing himself to the surprisingly small girl sitting in front of them, glaring at them with hostility and a manic grin, as if she didn't truly believe their intentions. My name is Shouta Aizawa, I'm the sensei of the two students the League has taken. Aizawa shifted back in his chair, pointedly nodding over to Tsukauchi as he continued speaking, and this is Detective Tsukauchi. We're on a little bit of a time crunch, so let's just get on with it. As his last sentence was directed to the detective, who nodded beside him, they turned towards the girl in front of them, Tsukauchi deciding to get straight to the point, we know that you've been interrogated before, but we'd like to ask you again. You've worked with the League, do you know where they might have taken Pixabab, Bakugo Katsuki, and Midoriya Izuku? Himiko only sneered, narrowing her eyes angrily, I'm not gonna out the League to a bunch of heroes like you, even if I only joined them because of Staney. Aizawa raised his brow, remembering the words of advice Nezu had given them before walking into her cell. She won't just give it to us for free either, so I suggest we push her buttons to see where we get and work from there. There is no doubt in my mind that she isn't mentally sane, so psychological manipulation may not work, but it isn't out of the question here, we need to get as much information out of her as possible. Ignoring the hostile words she had spat out before, Aizawa pushed forward, Staney? Do you mean Stain the hero killer? What, do you like that creep? An unsettling grin grew on her face as she rolled back onto her bed with a giggle before sitting quickly back up again excitedly, causing the heroes to lean back slightly as she moved around quickly. Staney's great. Trying to make a world where I can use my quirk freely just like the League. Her eyes went white as she excitedly exclaimed her love for Stain, giving the three men an opening to continue their search for the information they needed. Nezu and Tsukauchi let Aizawa take the lead. Oh, yay? What else do you like? Toga lifted her hand up to her chin dramatically as she thought, before giggling childishly, I love a Chako-chan. All the blood she was covered in made her look so pretty. Especially after that boy ripped her arm apart. There was so much blood dripping down his face too. He looked really pretty. A sly grin formed on her face as she blushed slightly. Do you think you could let me see Achako-chan again? I'd love to see her covered in blood again. Aizawa gave her a blank glare, not falling for the teenager's taunts. We'll have to see. Toga just giggled, swinging her legs back and forth between them. Tsukauchi took this moment to continue asking some of the questions which Nezu had given him. You seem to like blood a lot, has that got something to do with your quirk? They already knew the answer to that, only asking it to see what a reaction was to someone asking about her quirk. If what Nisa's research said was correct, her quirk was the reason why she had been outcast in the first place. Well, that, and the fact that she had almost murdered her own classmate before going on the run and killing others, but that was beside the point. That was very obvious when her guard came up quickly around her insane, cheery demeanor changing instantly. As if you care about how my quirk works, she spat out with a sneer. Stop digging for information about the few people who don't judge me for my quirk, you're not gonna get any information from me. That's not true. Her head snapped violently to the source of Aizawa's voice, meeting his serious yet determined stare. What? Aizawa stifled a sigh as he sat back lazily in his chair, trying to defuse the tense situation. Your quirk, it allows you to turn into people whose blood you drink, am I wrong? Toga didn't reply, this time Aizawa not bothering to hide his sigh of irritation at her teenage behavior as he continued speaking. You know, your quirk's very powerful, it must be very useful to have, he began, not putting it lightly, both Nezu and Tsukauchi giving him the side-eye as they wondered where the hell he was taking this. Why didn't you try to become a hero? Her reaction was like a slap to the face at his words, coming on almost instantaneously as the stress and anxiety of being caught and trapped in a police station starting to break her exterior. Only pausing in complete and utter shock for a moment for the insane words the man in front of her was saying. Seriously? A hero? Her disgust at the thought clearly visible. Do you really think someone like me could be a stupid hero? The anger in her voice was slowly turning hysterical as she laughed out loud at the inconceivable idea, her eyes whitening partially as she exclaimed dramatically to the three men opposite her. I crave people's blood, and not drinking it for a while sets me in a trance when I finally get my hands on it. I can smell blood coming from 100 yards away, and it tastes just so good. Why would anyone want a hero with a quirk like mine? What hero drinks blood? Toga sat back angrily with a huff, turning away from them on the bed, whilst bringing her legs up to her chest, resting her head on her knees as she refused to look back at them. She grumbled angrily to herself as a few traitorous tears dropped from her eyes. I was the demon of my family, my parents were disgusted with me, forcing me to suppress my quirk and urges for my whole life so I could live what they called normally. She paused for a moment, some of her last few words coming off sarcastically before turned to offer the heroes a rabid grin, as if she had suddenly remembered something, the insanity which had clawed its way into her mind, seeping through the cracks created by the life she had been forced to live. I want to live a normal life in the world the League is trying to create. And wasn't that something? Aizawa sat back in his chair, slowly going through her words. The claim of her parents calling her a demon, her craving for blood, and her ability to smell its presence from far away. It was all too similar to how some of the staff members of the Bloody Stain case choose to unknowingly address Midoriya. Far too similar for comfort. Your parents had no right to address you as a demon, Nezu quietly spoke in, causing the three other occupants to turn and look at him with surprise. The rat placed his paws in his lap, his beady little intelligent eyes watching Toga's every move as she glared at him hatefully, silently taking in his seemingly unwanted words. It's normal to want to live somewhere where you don't feel pressured to mask part of yourself to fit in with others around you, to have to pretend to be someone you're not. Toga sneered at him angrily. I'm a serial killer, my parents certainly weren't wrong, were they? I kill people just to see how pretty their blood looks on them for fun. Her anger turned sarcastic as she let out a laugh. Do you really think that I can help now, that I'm worth saving? You're a little bit late, don't you think? But you're more than welcome to try. The picture her words were painting wasn't pretty, as Aizawa was quickly starting to get an idea of what was going on inside the psychotic mind of the 17-year-old in front of him. A 17-year-old who had been shunned her whole life because of her quirk before the pressure burst in its usual violent way. You know, one of the students we're trying to rescue has a quirk similar to yours in its stance of how it makes them react to blood. Aizawa began aloofly, leaning his elbows on his knees, and he shifted in his seat. He's got a ghoul quirk, but I'm sure the League already made you aware of that before they sent you to our summer camp to kidnap him." Toga slumped back in her seat with an exasperated sigh once she realized her little psychotic break hadn't wavered their attempts to get information out of her. "Yay, so? They just told us to be wary of him, they didn't actually tell us what his quirk does in detail." Aizawa hummed in response, realizing that she really didn't have a clue what Midoriya's quirk did. "Midoriya's quirk requires that he lives off human flesh," he began, revealing bits of information that were already known to the wider public. "He's become a serial killer just so he could continue to live, but it doesn't have to be like that for him. He doesn't need to do that anymore because we want to help him, but we can't do that unless you tell us where they're keeping Midoriya and Bakugo hidden." And it was true. While Midoriya was by definition a serial killer, they wanted to help him from the cards he had been dealt, even if the number of people who wouldn't agree with their decision was in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. At least the more vocal members of the Bloody Stain task force had been stuck under the same boundaries as his students, preventing the still extremely vulnerable data from reaching the press. It had gotten to the point where members of the original force that had been put together were being asked to leave by the higher-ranking officials within the circle of UA, who had the full knowledge of who the Bloody Stain was and what their intentions had turned out to be. The first meeting after the summer camp had been a mess, with All Might dealing with it the worst of all. At least it hadn't taken long to get the staff members on board once they had heard who, why and what had happened. Present Mick hadn't needed any prompting of all knowing full well what it was like to be segregated because of their quirk, especially from when he was younger, even if it wasn't to the same extent as the situation they faced. "And why should I help so-called heroes like you, all greedy for nothing but fame and fortune?" Toga spat sarcastically, parroting the words of Stain, the hero killer in the process. "Because he wants to become a true hero who saves people because it's the right thing to do. Fame and fortune are not his priority, and we want to help him achieve that." Aizawa countered automatically, staring determinedly towards Toga as he continued, "He's brave and has risked himself and his entire livelihood just to save his friends." Toga let out an annoyed huff. "He might have looked pretty in blood, but that's just stupid." Aizawa ignored her. "What his quirk is doesn't bother me. It's not his fault that he can't control the quirk that he was given, or what he has to do to survive to live another day. It's his drive to become a true hero which does. I agree that this world has got far too many heroes who do it just for the money and fame, but Midoriya isn't like that, and that's why I want to find him." Both Tsukauchi and Nezu turned to look at him, almost as if to stop him, while Toga simultaneously shifted her head towards him, slightly surprised by his seemingly unheroic words. He pressed on. "Just as Midoriya's quirk requires unfavorable situations to keep him alive, I understand that how your quirk requires to function isn't your fault, and you should never have been treated or judged how you were by your parents or peers in the first place." Toga had her head resting on her knees as she sat silently, not making any movement to respond, as she slowly started to understand what the homeless-looking hero in front of her was trying to say. Aizawa sat back in his chair as he finished the statements he had been determined to get across to her, folding his arms as he did so as he felt somewhat successful from the lack of responses coming from the teen, who was usually full of retorts. Both Nezu and Tsukauchi eyed him with surprise, praying that his words would get them some answers, not really bothering to decide if their co-worker was being truthful or manipulative to the blonde-haired girl. The room was silent for a tense moment, each side waiting for the other to react first. Once nothing happened, Aizawa spoke up yet again. "I wasn't kidding when I said your quirk would be useful for heroics." That was all that it took to get a reaction, as Toga turned to look affronted, yet attitude surprisingly far more tame than before. "And who in their right mind would want a hero who's murdered people, who drinks human blood?" Aizawa sat up in his seat as his exhaustion and stress began to flood into his words as he spoke. His mind unfortunately supplying the memories of another lost UA student from long ago as he feared for his students' well-being. "In the world of underground heroics, very few people care what your quirk does or how it works." He began seriously, "You don't have to play by the rules as much, not bound by the image of what people perceive heroes to be. There have been times where I've had to kill people for the sake of getting others out alive." Toga shifted uncomfortably in her seat as she silently listened to his words. Civilians don't realize that heroics isn't all about the glory of winning fights and saving people. It's not possible to be a good hero without getting dirty, people do get hurt, and people unfortunately die. All that matters is saving as many people as you can before the building collapses around you, crushing you from above. He knew he would be getting conversation from Nezu after this, but at this point, he didn't care. Toga didn't want to be fed false information, she was a villain and knew damn well that heroes weren't perfect. There was no point sugar-coating the dark side of their hero society when she had already faced that world alone. He was sure that she would much rather appreciate having someone be honest to her than lying to her face, and if he wanted to get the information he needed to gain her trust because at that moment all he cared about was his students and ensuring their safety. Aizawa sighed aloud, rubbing his forehead as his mind caught up with himself as he processed what he had said, knowing the risks he was talking to someone who had already been failed by the system like this. Being a real hero isn't all fun and games, I'm sure you already know that, but it could give you a normal life. He took a moment to pause, his last couple of words emphasizing his point. It would take time, you wouldn't be allowed to just go out on your own straight away. But after all the processes have gone through you'd be able to use your quirk freely within the law, while saving hundreds if not thousands of lives. And we can help you make it happen, we just need your help to find where the League are. He was playing with fire trying to persuade a villain to change sides, it didn't help that he knew there would also be hundreds if not thousands of people opposing their promises. Why do you think I would trust that, why should I trust you? Toga mumbled out spitefully, why should I betray the League? Aizawa leant forward, his eyes calculating as they narrowed seriously, not bothering to sugarcoat anything as he spoke clearly and forwardly towards her. Because we're giving you a chance to live a normal life, where you could use your quirk within the limits of the law. Toga rolled her eyes, turning her head away from the heroes as she began to lose interest in the same repetitive words, leaving Aizawa grimacing at her reaction from behind. You have no reason to believe us, I get that, heroes have failed you before. Aizawa began, a sense of serious urgency building in his voice, but I intend to stick to my words, I have no intention of failing you or my students who need to be saved. I swear I won't let that happen. Toga shifted in her seat as she eyed Aizawa cautiously, waiting for the hero to speak, oh yeah, and how on you plan on doing that? Aizawa started with a confident huff. Well, for starters, if you decide to help us, it will give us a lot to work with when it comes to convicting your awful parents of emotional child abuse. No should get away with that, no matter what their child is like. Toga turned to look at him with subtle surprise before she let out a low sigh, slumping down in her seat childishly as she turned to face them, knowing full well that this was the only option she was going to get. Even if she knew it would lead her down a long trail of therapy and rehabilitation to get there. She knew deep down that she hadn't known the League long enough for them to see her as valuable enough to pull her out of the mess she had found herself in now. Maybe Big Sis Magni would care enough for it twice. Not that it would matter since it was Shigaraka's decision. In reality, she knew she had nothing to lose. Fine, I'll help you, but I only know where the blonde kid got taken, Toga began dully, her voice ridden from the childish exterior she had painted over it before. Shigaraka's boss wanted Midoriya-kun. But if Bakugo refused to cooperate, there's a good chance that Shigaraka's either disintegrated him or given him to his sketchy boss or something. Weren't the implications behind that terrifying? But even if the possibility of Toga being a hero were a vague possibility in the distance, it gave her something for her to latch onto, and Aizawa would be damned if all his hard work and her trust went to waste. Do you know where the League of Villains base is? Todoroki quickly began asking, not wasting any time getting the information they needed, with both Nezu and Aizawa asking questions on the site as they quickly put together a dark image of what laid before them. But even with the thoughts of those horrible possibilities, a wave of hope blew over the trio, finally getting some of the information they desperately needed. No matter how depressing it sounded, they finally had a start. Toga twisted back to face the heroes, her shoes barely reaching the floor off the chair. Yes, I do. Finally, they had a location. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and things were quickly beginning to get into action. The two heroes left offering Toga their grateful thanks, leaving Todoroki behind as he began keeping to their word as he questioned her about her past and parents. Outside the interrogation room, the Aizawa and Nezu quickly began making their way with the information they needed towards the police station exit. The thumps of heavy feet walking down the corridor along with the small pittering of toes down the corridor were all that could be heard as the principal called out to his work colleague. Aizawa. Aizawa ignored him as he continued walking away from the interrogation room towards the police station exit, Nezu trailing quickly behind him as he tried to keep up. Aizawa-san. Not now, we need to get back to UA and set up a counterattack. Aizawa gritted out as he set his determination on getting out of the building and away from the principal as fast as possible, knowing what was coming if he gave Nezu a chance to speak. Aizawa? Please listen. With a tired sigh, Aizawa slowly came to a stop as he turned to face the principal, who came to a stop beside him with his little legs. If this is about what I said, then forget it, it's nothing to worry about. We need to get back to UA to start planning. He grumbled out with annoyance, subconsciously allowing the principal to grab a hold of the end of his capture weapon as he began to climb up to his shoulders. Nezu ignored his words as he spoke, settling himself down onto Aizawa's shoulder. I know, we need to get back as quickly as we can, but Aizawa-kun, the principal began sincerely, turning to look at his silently walking colleague. What happened back then? To Shirakumo-kun, it won't happen again. At Nisa's words, Aizawa dipped his face further into his scarf, the connotations from his outburst before quickly coming back to light. It didn't take long for Nezu to sense his resentment of the topic as he shifted to hide his face from the mammal, a small yet winced smile, the only thing Nezu could provide as he continued talking. Your students are strong, and Midoriya-kun and Bakugo-kun even more so. They're both truly resilient people. I can assure you, we will find them before it's too late. Aizawa slowed in his pace as he lowered his face further into his scarf, suddenly feeling uncomfortable as his boss hit the nail on the head of his concerns. Damn stupid intelligent thing. I know how strong-willed the pair of them are. Neither of them stops at anything to achieve their goals, but this is different from school lessons or even the USJ attack. He let out a small defeated sigh as he paused. I'm more concerned about how long the pair of them can hold out. It's already been 3, almost 4 days with nothing to go on. Nezu nodded solemnly. It's true, but remember, Midoriya has already endured far more than anyone else his age without giving in. While the choices he's made haven't led him down a clear path, the fact he's latest this only without any help is remarkable. Credit must be given where credit is due. The principal watched with a kinder smile as Aizawa slowly turned his head back towards him. And don't forget, Bakugo is far too driven to become the next #1 hero to let a group of villains take him down. The pair of them are smart, and I don't doubt that we will find them alive. Nisa's overconfident demeanor did little to ease Shouta's nerves, but the small intelligent mammal wasn't wrong. If he had to choose 2 worse students for the villains to choose to turn to their side, there were no worse options than those 2. Aizawa closed his eyes for a brief moment as he accepted his boss's words, his eyes opening full of determination and strength as he did so. I sure damn hope you're right. Chapter 34. An organized mess. The police station headquarters was an organized mess. Police and heroes from the bloody stain case charging around with heroes who had been recruited to invade the bar. Toga had leaped to them, preparing to capture the villains. We're going to have to catch them off guard. We'll use the TV interview Aizawa-san, Vlad-san, and I will be holding this evening as cover. We're going to have to word our replies to any questions the press may ask about our plans of a counterattack vaguely to lower the guard. They won't be expecting an attack while simultaneously listening to us stumbling around on our feet. Nisa's words were adamant as the larger meeting room table he stood at the helm of was surrounded by almost 100 members of the police and hero communities combined, with All Might standing by his side. Each member in the room was aware of the troubles and truths behind what they were about to face. I need everyone to listen carefully as give out the necessary information need to deal with each person we have listed as the possible threat and how to counter them all. Need I remind you all that Midoriya and his quirk may leave him vulnerable due to the effects of his quirk. That doesn't mean he's a threat, but he may be in a hostile state, therefore I've written in detail about how to safely secure him too. One of the heroes who were partnered with the bloody stain case sighed exasperatedly. Why don't we just take him out before he has the chance to retaliate against us? Even if his attention is directed to the villains when we get them out, how long will it be before he turns against us? The heroes of UA turned to glare at the uninterested hero, with even All Might turning to face him with an angered frown against his usual heroic smile. Thankfully, Nezu was able to bite back with a hidden feral look before the #1 hero and his staff were able to retaliate to the careless words. We shall do no such thing, he declared, raising his angered tone above the murmurs which scattered across the room. It seems as if this hero wasn't the only one with doubts. After the identity of the Ghoul had been released to the group who had signed up to rescue the missing students and hero, it hadn't taken long for people to begin backing out, because who wants to rescue a killer who could turn on the few people able to aid them? Midoriya is just as much a priority to save safely as Bakugo or Pixabob-san. What he's done in the past can't be changed. All we need to worry about is rescuing them all before it's too late and getting Midoriya and Bakugo back to the safety of UA and Pixabab back to her home with the wild pussycats. Unfortunately, another irate hero butted in. We didn't work our asses off over the last year looking for this villain to bring him to justice for the pain he's caused to Kamui Woods and the murders of over 15 people. You expect us to just all allow you to take that serial killer and keep him inside UA? That's ridiculous. Thankfully, the chief of police and head of the Bloody Stain task force stepped in. There is no chance of Midoriya being allowed to wander around without supervision after his rescue, apart from the fact both he and Bakugo need to be monitored to ensure no more kidnapping attempts take place. Both Nezu and I have already come to an agreement to carefully monitor his eating schedule and reduce Midoriya's quirk usage while being held at UA. The chief narrowed his eyes at the distasteful glare the opposing heroes were giving them as he continued speaking. We need to ensure he continues his studies until a suitable course of action is found, which will ensure the other students' safety, or until his stomach can be replaced with a new, suitable donor. That being said, he won't be allowed to join in with his hero classes or use his quirk at all until after a route is found. We are not taking any risks when it comes to things which may affect his hunger. Tensions in the room continued to rise as members of the group began to become more agitated by their opposition by the second. A new stomach, how do you even know that's gonna work? It's impossible to break that brat's skin without it regenerating. He shouldn't even be allowed back into UA, he should be held in Tartarus or executed. He's got more murders under his belt than half of the known members of the League of Villains, and you want to let him walk away without facing the consequences for his actions. The offhanded insult to his student quickly began to tick Aizawa off, the hero's needlessly spiteful words infuriating him. The villains Midoriya attacked were all villains themselves with records of sexual assault, burglary, kidnapping, and murder themselves. Aizawa spat out angrily, his eyes narrowing dangerously towards the no-name hero on the other side of the table. His presence alone had reduced the number of villains in the city drastically. Not to mention the impact he has caused taking out the hero killer. The anger pooling in the other hero's stomach began to rise as he cut Aizawa's comeback off with his own. It doesn't matter that he's reduced the number of villains in the area. Aizawa countered, raising his voice above the others as he clashed back furiously against him. Hundreds of villain attacks have been prevented by him over the last year. Hundreds of people who may have been caught up and killed in needless attacks, avoided because the villains in the city are scared they'd be next. I'm pretty sure that homeless man wasn't a villain. He didn't even know he had his quirk then, it was an accident he couldn't have controlled. How do you even know that's what happened? We haven't even spoken to him since we discovered he's the villain. But it doesn't excuse that he's still a serial killer. That homeless man was innocent. Aizawa snapped his mouth shut, holding himself back as the other hero finished off with a bastardly smug grin, like he had won an award, instead of discussing the future of a child who had no other choices in what to do. You and the rest of the staff at UA are all being biased because you know the kid, the hero continued sarcastically before shaking his head in disbelief as he lowered his voice down. You don't see how this looks from an outsider, from the view of us low-classes heroes who were placed on this case, not knowing what it was going to come to. You can't tell us just to see him as innocent when all we've ever seen him be is a killer, and that's all that matters here. Because unfortunately, he wasn't wrong. The room shifted awkwardly for a tense moment. Every pair of eyes looked around the room for an answer, for confirmation that something was going to fix the flaws in the details above. Only a few no-name heroes who truly opposed Aizawa ideals standing with a challenging glare which shouted directed straight back. He could barely withhold his sigh of relief as Nezu softly spoke in before he blew a casket. Among the millions of children who awaken their quirks each year, there are hundreds of unfortunate people who awaken their quirks in situations which lead to the deaths of people around them. The angered hero, who still had his eyes set sharply on Aizawa, on the other side of the room, narrowed his eyes with annoyance as he turned to face the Nezu with an exasperating look. That's not the same. The only difference here is that Midoriya was used by someone to gain his quirk, and that he's that much older than the average child who awakens their quirks each year. Nezu continued, looking up at the hero who was trying to challenge him. From what both Todoroki and Uraraka-san have said, he wasn't aware he had a quirk until after that incident had happened, an incident he'd confessed to the pair of them to have no control over. The no-name hero folded his arms with an unimpressed huff, begrudgingly agreeing with Nisa's answer, and most of those children are put under heavy quirk regulation and legal proceeding, some of which still have to face their consequences for manslaughter. That doesn't answer for the rest of his murders which he voluntarily committed. How can you be sure that he's not going too insane and start killing and eating everyone in the school? The room remained silent for a while as Nezu quietly waited for him to settle before answering. We won't be letting Midoriya straight into the school after rescuing him, if that's what you believe is happening. We've already got plans to interrogate him to get to the bottom of what happened. We want to ensure our students' safety, and we certainly won't be allowing him back into UA if he's lied to Uraraka-san and Todoroki-san until we have clear confirmation that he hasn't been working or interacting with the League. The hero narrowed his eyes with annoyance before sighing, standing down from the argument as the tension from both sides slowly dissipated. Aizawa slumped back down to his tired posture, looking over to Nezu to continue giving the information on the League out. We've gotten confirmation about the location of the League of Villains base, however, we are unsure if Midoriya will be in the same location as Bakugo and Pixabob. If the villains make a run to escape, we need to ensure the trackers given to us are placed on them as a last resort and follow them so we can trace it back to their fallback lair. The scramble to get everyone prepared to counterattack was far more stressful than the meeting held beforehand, with thankfully far fewer arguments and disagreements floating around as everyone quickly, if not begrudgingly, got on with what they had to do. No matter how much some of them disagreed with the course of action, they were heroes, lives were at stake. Within a matter of hours of receiving the location they needed from Toga, with the TV interview as cover, the raid team was almost prepped to go. All Might was holding himself up in another room as he rested his hero form before the attack, when to his surprise, Aizawa walked in with a suit and tie. "Aizawa-san? What are you doing here?" The dark-haired hero shifted uncomfortably as he looked awkwardly around the room, seemingly avoiding eye contact with him. "I came to see how you were doing, how are you holding up?" He paused, looking around at the walls, "With all this crap that's been going on?" Ah yes, Aizawa never was very good at trying to comfort people, no matter how hard he tried to put on a brave face for his students in need. "I've had better days." All Might began with a head-slumped sigh before looking back towards the underground hero. "I should be asking you that question. Really, they're your students after all." Aizawa turned to face him with a solemn look. "Yes, but you teach the lot of them too." He let out an almost pained sigh as he turned to finally face All Might, who sat silently on the opposite side of the room, looking completely out of place in his small form and hero costume. "You're not as good at hiding your favoritism over Midoriya as you may think, Yagi-san." Yagi's eyes widened partially, beginning to open his mouth to deny his accusation. "What?" Aizawa lifted his hand up to rub his forehead, cutting Yagi off. "You care as much about all the students I do, but we've all noticed how you've stuck closer to his side than the rest of us." Aizawa couldn't help but look away again as he mumbled uncharacteristically, the doubt which had been clouding his thoughts over the last couple of days coming back to light. "Did I miss something? Did you see any signs of him calling out for help which I missed?" Yagi's eyes widened with surprise and worry as Aizawa's guilt from feeling responsible for letting Midoriya slip past the cracks unnoticed silently burdened him. "I didn't notice anything wrong with him either, Aizawa. It's not your fault for not seeing something he'd almost perfectly hid from us all for so long. None of us had any idea." Aizawa remained silent as he slowly lifted his head up to look towards the number one hero. "I truly enjoy teaching the hero course students, but I can't deny I am rather fond of Midoriya." He paused, lowering his head with some kind of pessimistic nostalgia. "The only reason I can think of why I've subconsciously favored him is because of how much his willpower and spirit to become a hero reminded me so much of my own before my injury." Aizawa looked at All Might with surprise before his shocked expression gently turned into something of a tiresome, wincing smile. The pair remained in silence for a while, the quiet ticking from both of their watches, the only thing telling that time was passing. "Yagi-san." All Might looked up questioningly as Aizawa called out his civilian name and began to address him. "During the rescue, if when you see Midoriya, be careful." Aizawa stifled his sigh with a deep breath. "I know I arguing with those other heroes earlier about whether Midoriya was dangerous or not, but I need you to know now that I was trying to downplay the reality we have to face here. To try and keep him out of the hands of the government and police." The sudden seriousness of the conversation made Yagi narrow his eyes with reluctant understanding. "Midoriya, just like anyone else, can be dangerous in the wrong situation. I wouldn't put it past him to be terrified out of his mind right now and react unpredictably. He's been held hostage for days, possibly without food. So just remember that even though you may favor Midoriya and Midoriya might fanboy over you, he might not be in the right state of mind to control himself, let alone even recognize you." Aizawa trailed off as All Might quickly got the message, silently eyeing the scar on the man's cheek, given to him by the same student in question only a few months ago. Aizawa looked down at the deflated man before him and the separate missions the pair of them would have to take if they wanted to have any hope of rescuing their students and Pixie Bob in one piece, whatever it would take. Aizawa always used to claim he disliked All Might for his over-the-top persona and smiles, which blinded the heroes and civilians alike from the cruelty the world had to offer. Now he realized that his judgment was misplaced. The pair of them, his students at UA and heroes, whose lights had been dimmed by the events of the past year and a half. All of them had all faced too much for just one man's smile to blind. It was unfair to place Yagi on such an impossible pedestal. As the alarms on both their watches struck 7:30 p.m., the pair knew that Phase 1 was about to launch into action. "Yagi-san, don't worry yourself." Aizawa's voice filtered through the room determinedly. "We will find him eventually, and we will get him back safely. The TV broadcast was finally in action. "You spoke about your students' safety, Eraserhead. But during the incident, very bare reports, published by the police department and the Wild Pussycats agency, on the events of the night, specify the use of students using their quirks. What was the reason behind this?" The riling words of the press had soon begun piling in as soon as the event went live, leaving Aizawa irritated beyond belief. At the time, we hadn't had the opportunity to fully grasp the size of the situation. We didn't know which villains were in the area and the risks they brought. Therefore, the students were instructed by my authority to use their quirks to defend themselves in a time of need to prevent the worst possible outcome. The annoying news reporter took no time challenging every word the three heroes at the front of the stage had to offer. "What do you mean by worst possible outcome? Surely the kidnapping of 2 students and pro-hero Pixie Bob, not mentioning the other 26 victims created by the attack, the worst possible outcome?" Each word coming out of their mouth, challenging the heroes' decisions as if the attack was their fault, made Aizawa more infuriated by the second. The worst-case outcome of the situation at the time was all 40 students stuck without instruction, which would have resulted in them being killed. Some of them would have been dead if it wasn't for Midoriya. Aizawa couldn't have been more thankful once Nezu began to step in. The majority of the 26 victims were unfortunately harmed by the gas we've identified as a sleeping agent from one of the villain's quirks, something which wasn't stated in the press release earlier this week. All the students who were affected by this quirk have been treated and are all on their way to a smooth recovery. We are also encouraging students to take up our offer for mental care to tackle any psychological problem they may face. However, we have yet to see any signs of serious trauma from any of them. The gray-haired news reporter didn't seem too impressed. That doesn't seem to be very reassuring. The press release we all saw had little to no data on the villain at the attack or the causes of why the 26 students were sent to the hospital. Other than the identities of the abducted students and hero, very little is known about the attack, other than the deaths of 2 unspecified villains and the capture of 3 more. Tell me, how did the deaths of these villains occur and who were they? There was an uneasy moment of silence as the trio of heroes silently decided how to tackle this question. The 2 unnamed deaths reported from the attack belong to Inomu, something we have already seen from the attacks based in Hosu, and the USJ that can only be taken down if destroyed correctly, and serial killer Muscular. Several gasps of shock and fear were heard at once as the name of the notorious murderer was spilled from Aizawa's mouth, Muscular's name already far too well known from the water hose murders to go unnoticed. Even the dull, bland-faced reporter seemed shocked with anger. Why wasn't this information released in the police's initial report? Surely they should have known. Who was responsible for the deaths of those villains? Are you trying to withhold information the public has a right to know? The underlying "what are you hiding?" question was clear even if unspoken, and Aizawa was not enjoying the tone of the reporter before them as his words began to become laced with mild spite. Legally, the public has no right to any information on the attack, thanks to the laws which surround child safety regulations in the media. At UA, along with the joint decision with the head of the Tokyo Police Department, who serves over the camp area the attack took place, have decided to protect the identity of the students responsible for any bodily harm caused to the villains. This includes those responsible for the 2 deaths of the villains. The reporter wasn't having any of it. Surely those responsible for the deaths of those villains should face the same charges anyone else should face for killing someone. Thankfully Vlad spoke in turn before Aizawa had a chance to implode on the man. Each of the deaths were the result of a student having to use self-defense to protect not only themselves but their fellow students around them, and has been classed under an act of self-defense. Without their interference, the outcome of the attack would have been far direr. Just like with all civilians, quirk usage is permitted as self-defense. Without their interference, the outcome of the attack would have been far direr. They did what they thought they needed to do to keep themselves and others safe. The reporter began twisting his words. And what about Bakugo Katsuki and Midoriya Izuku, can you say the same for them? They both went to the same middle school, with Bakugo entering into UA with excellent marks before winning the sports festival. Yet was seen to behave rather violently during the matches and award ceremony towards the end of the event. Is it possible that the villains kidnapped Bakugo to try and guide him towards a path of evil? Aizawa felt his eyebrow twitch with aggravation and the inappropriate words which continued to flow from the reporter's mouth. Furthermore, how do you respond to the accusation placed against Midoriya? He was remarked as quirkless during middle school before changing his official public paperwork to claim he wasn't only a few short weeks before managing to get into the UA Hero course. A quirk with little to no show during the sports festival. The report continued spewing crap from his mouth as Aizawa grew more furious by the second. Is it possible that Midoriya was working with these villains before joining UA, having used his previously quirkless identity to avoid being suspected? Do you think the league may have been using Midoriya to spy on UA? Or even spying on Bakugo as a potential ally before even joining the school? Aizawa had enough, standing up with fury before he stifled his feelings and bowed with a sarcastic connotation towards the reporters. Both Midoriya and Bakugo are outstanding students, both putting their all into becoming the greatest heroes they can be. Bakugo's behavior at the sports festival originates from what he's deemed as ideal strength, treating his opponents equally and fairly, using his strength to the best of his abilities. To him, anything less would be considered an insult. I apologize, as his educator, for the violent behavior he displayed. However, if the villain saw his actions as an opening, they are sorely mistaken. He lifted his head as he glared down at the reporter who stood before him. As for Midoriya, he was caught in a traumatic incident before his enrollment to UA, triggering his quirk's manifestation. We at UA, as well as his family and classmates, would appreciate it if people would stop attacking my student for an incident that dramatically changed his life, instead of coming to fabricated conclusions. He paused as he saw Vlad watching him hesitantly as he subtly narrowed his eyes, not bothering to look over towards his apprehensive co-worker beside him, his hostility to the few people who stood closely around him. Midoriya is one of the most driven students I've seen coming through UA's doors, and I won't allow you to drag his name through the mud on live television. A low murmur rumbled through the crowd of news reports at the jab directed towards the provoking man, who just narrowed his eyes with annoyance at his response before continuing with his job. Looking down at his notebook to read off another pre-written question as Aizawa moved to sit back down into his chair. God, he despised the media. That doesn't answer my questions. Do you have any plans in place to capture these villains who have taken these UA students and Pro Pixabop? Thankfully Nezu took over. We are currently working with the police and the pro-hero community to find and capture these villains. We will not allow them to get away with the mess they have caused, terrorizing our school or the hero system. The abductions of the two hero students and pro-hero Pixabop, however, are our top priority, and we are doing everything we can to find them. Chapter 35. Failed Rescue. As the heroes began to prepare themselves and move to their attack positions, the League of Villains sat obliviously in their dark gloomy bar as they unknowingly watched the decoy press conference on their small flat-screen TV. Shigaraki sat slumped on his bar stool, scratching his neck feverishly as his long pale hair fell down around his face. Sensei, has that brat been eaten yet? His cold voice rang out with boredom as he spoke to the second TV stood upon the bar table, the other villains eyeing him cautiously, with curiously lingering in their eyes as Shigaraki's words caught their attention. There was a tense moment as the room quietened down to silence when the crackle of the TV came through and the low hum of a dark voice could be heard rattling from the speakers. The pair of them are both still alive and well within their cell, Shigaraki. Shigaraki narrowed his eyes, looking down from the empty TV screen as his hand paused in thought on his neck, grumbling aloud to himself with an irritated sigh, why too can't that stupid brat just get on and eat him? The rest of the villains in the room watched silently as a malicious laugh rang from the speakers, only the sounds of the UA press conference could be heard murmuring in the background. "Don't worry yourself, young Tamura. Midoriya has been trying to prolong his dear friend's life, eating his own flesh. However, I can assure you that won't work for long. Bakugo will die in good time." Shigaraki narrowed his eyes with annoyance before looking back towards the UA press conference on the flat-screen TV attached to the wall. "And what about Bakugo Katsuki and Midoriya Izuku, can you say the same for them? Look at those stupid heroes, even the NPCs are keeping them too busy on their toes," Shigaraki trialed out with a vile grin, the rest of the villains now watching the TV screen along with him. "I'm surprised that they haven't confessed to housing a villain in their school," one of the villains, Magni, murmured to herself, loud enough for the others to hear. A sigh could be heard as Shigaraki ignored the conversation happening behind him. "They're just trying to save face while they can. They won't be able to hold off the reporters finding the information themselves for long, they'll get the information themselves." The scared man leaning sloppily against a wall replied, causing some of the others to look over to him. Shigaraki turned away from the press conference towards the bar with an irritated sigh. "I wish they would just hurry up, I don't want to have to release another data pack into the system just yet." Some of the other villains let out an uncomfortable groan at the computer reference, which Shigaraki begrudgingly ignored. There was no use killing them yet, these were the only players who seemed to be of any use to him after all. Is it possible that the villains kidnapped Bakugo to try and guide him towards a path of evil? The League watched silently as the reporters tried to drag UA's reputation through the mud before targeting the two children they had kidnapped. Is it possible that Midoriya was working with these villains before joining UA, having used his previously quirkless identity to avoid being suspected? Do you think the League may have been using Midoriya to spy on UA? Or even spying on Bakugo as a potential ally before even joining the school? Those reporters aren't pulling any punches, are they? Compress murmured as he leant on his hand rested on the edge of the table, causing a few silently nods of agreement. Their sensei doesn't seem too pleased about how ruthlessly they're going for his students. Shigaraki only grumbled out with annoyance as he raised the volume of the TV, annoyed at everyone talking over it. "I still can't believe that brat wouldn't join us," he began, scratching at the scabby skin around his neck as flakes began to fall off. Even those NPCs thought he would. Both Midoriya and Bakugo are outstanding students, both putting their all into becoming the greatest heroes they can be. Shigaraki growled with annoyance as the hero's words from the TV unknowingly countered his words, narrowing his eyes furiously as he brought both his hands up to the sides of his neck to scratch the dead flakes scabbing away. "Shigaraki, it may be in your best interests to stop scratching your skin, you're only going to make it worse." A couple of knocks came from the hard wooden door, causing their small world to come to a tense screeching halt. The League of Villains froze as time seemed to pause in place, the sounds interrupting Karageras's nagging as it came, as they all stared cautiously towards the door, waves of confusion and tension radiating throughout the room. "Midoriya is one of the most driven students I've seen coming through UA's doors, and I won't allow you to drag his name through the mud on live television." The TV continued on without them. "Hello? Pizza delivery." Shigaraka's eyes narrowed on guard as he concentrated on the door in front of him, ignoring Spinner complaining as he leant forward from the wall he was resting upon. "Pizza? Which one of you idiots ordered a pizza? Smas." Spinner didn't get to finish his words as the wall exploded in, shattering the bricks and glass, as All Might barged into the room, full of fury with his signature smile nowhere in sight as he saw the lack of friendly familiar figures in the room. He lunged into the room with an infuriated yell as he made way for the rest of the heroes outside to pile into the room from the hole in the wall. "Where are the two boys and Pixabab you kidnapped?" All Might yelled furiously as he turned to face Shigaraki, who was sat back on his stood stunned as the front door simultaneously slamming of its hinges as Edgeshot, Gran Torino, and Best Jeanist work together to apprehend the villains in the room before they have a chance to counterattack. Their surprise attack had worked, leaving the villains cornered and unable to escape, Gran Torino reassuring that Dobby was unable to interrupt their arrests as he knocked the blue-flamed villain out. Leaving Best Jeanist and Edgeshot to waste no time quickly entangling the villains into their quirk's restraints. "All Might, all the villains have been apprehended." Best Jeanist yelled over the sound of the commotion going on outside, giving All Might the opportunity to furiously walk up to Shigaraki, who laid almost motionless with shock on the bar side. Shigaraki tossed his head to the side at the impact as his father's hand went flying from his face from the impact of Edgeshot's quirk, forcefully holding him down. His eyes widened with blithering rage and shock as he looked down at the lifeless dead flesh of his mask. An evil, sadistic thought popped into his mind to see the look of absolute despair wipe the face of the number one hero's face clean from his smile forever again. Dead. He turned his face back slowly towards his declared archenemy with a vile, heartless grin formed on his face. His knotted, greasy, pale hair sticking to his face as his lips spilled the few words which terrified the number one hero more than his last deadly battle over 5 years ago. They're dead. His manic grin widening as he saw the look of abhorred horror show through the tight skin of the man he loathed the most, lying straight towards his face. No. The number one hero's words were nothing more than a whisper as his face grew slack with defeat, taking a distraught step away from the psychotic villain in front of him, as silence rang around the room at the sounds of his voice. The rest of the heroes in the room turning to look at the villain's leader with widened eyes and jaws dropped horror. The distraction created from the hero's realization gave Shigaraki just enough time to wiggle in his space to bring his hand up towards Edgeshot's body, which held him tightly to the ground, chuckling hysterically as he did so. They're all dead. His fingertips slammed down dramatically onto the fresh skin of Edgeshot's body, holding him down, causing the hero to yell in agony and flinch away in pain, the action freeing both Shigaraki and some of the other villains in one swift movement. Sensei. Portal. Now. The actions of the villains escaping knocked All Might back into the present as he screamed furiously at them, turning to grab the closest person he could, only for them to vanish from his grasp as a blur of gruesome slime and gunge. Within a matter of seconds, the villains had escaped, leaving only the heroes behind to listen to the agonizing yells of Edgeshot as he made the maddening decision to grab a knife from his hero costume and dismember the disintegrating limb from his body. Best Jeanist wasting no time running over to him to cut the blood circulation off to the area to prevent the hero from bleeding to death on the spot. All Might stood back in disbelief as looked around with white and guilt-stricken eyes. The sight of the destroyed room, covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, watching in horror at the scene which surrounded him. Edgeshot slowly fell to the ground in pain as he clamped his only remaining arm down into the limbless joint, the detached limb falling into dust a few meters away. Best Jeanist ran to his aid, a look of worried terror for his colleague as they worked together to stop the bleeding. Paramedics only now arrived on the scene to assist. Gran Torino, among the rest of the heroes surrounding the building, looking into the building with hopeless loss at their failure. The rest of the building was deserted, with no signs of Bakugo and Midoriya in sight, and the villains had escaped, with no tracker placed to trace. The villains had gone, and they had nothing left to follow. All Might let his heroic form down with a pop of despair as the dust in the air around them began to settle. At least, with no epic battle, there was no one around to film his weakened form silently tearing. God fucking damn it. Those heroes have been tracking us. Shigaraka's scream could be heard raging through the building where All for One had teleported them to, the same facility which had both Midoriya and Bakugo locked away in a cell only a few floors below. What do you want us to do, Shigaraki? Dabi demanded, shouting back at the childish man, who was furiously scratching his neck as he looked around the Nomu lab they had been dropped in. God damn it. God freaking damn it. The villains seemed to have been at a panicked loss as their leader kept swearing to himself, not noticing the man who stood in the shadows only a few feet behind them. Young Shigaraki, I suggest you start moving and get anything you may require from here. I suspect the heroes may have traced you here too. The cold voice speaking from the shadows made the other villains jump from their skins, and they all flinched to look behind of All for One making his way forward, Shigaraki seemingly the only one unbothered by his appearance. Shit. Alright. Shigaraki cursed to himself, turning to look at Magni with a deranged expression. Go and grab those brats from downstairs. There's no point holding them here if those bastardly heroes show up. Magni nodded, looking around along with the rest of the villains towards their leader, with similar looks of uneasy stress and paranoid tension. They're 2 floors below us. All for One's haunting voice rang out. I assume they are both still alive, but it's been a while since I've checked on them. I suggest you're cautious nonetheless. The group of villains looked up at the Bujiman warily as Magni slowly nodded before steadily speeding up as she sprinted off to grab their hostages. The villains stood in silence as they listened to the constant whirring of the machines around them and the irritating sounds coming from Shigaraki. All stood on guard as they watched All for One finally speak up again, as Magni had finished turning the corner at the end of the room. With that being said, I do suggest that some more of you go and assist her. I don't think she will last very long against a hungry ghoul on her own. The rest of the villains' eyes widened with realization, excluding Shigaraki, who was too busy with this irritating skin, as some of them cursed and began turning to chase behind her one by one. Once it was only Shigaraki and All for One left in the room, All for One turned to look at his student with detached concern as he stood irritating his skin, his eyes staring blankly at the wall as they filled with madness from his mask, which had seemingly at some point dropped from his face. Shigaraki. The pale blue-haired boy in question seethed angrily to himself as he replied to his master. Sensei, what are we going to do? All for One released a low dark chuckle that would send shivers of ice down anyone's spine who listened in hard enough, his head rolling up to the ceiling as he said so. Don't you worry yourself, young Shigaraki. I'll ensure that you and your friends make it out safely. You have nothing to worry about at all. Shigaraki looked up from where he was standing towards his sensei, his hair half clung to his face with sweat and grease. And what about you, sensei? All for One let out an almost nostalgic breath. I'll stay here and make sure no one is able to follow you. The room was stagnant from noise as the two boys sat motionless opposite each other, neither of them making any effort to move or escape as they stared dully towards the floor, both silently waiting for an opportunity to present itself. Waves of despair and exhaustion mixed together sloppily as they steadily flooded the room they were contained in, drowning the boys with its imperceptible state, slowly draining the pair from all the yearning they held of being rescued. Ever since All for One had chucked Midoriya in this cell, 3 days had unknowingly passed, with Bakugo joining him in the last few hours, saving him from the silent torture he had endured alone. 3 days alone without food, 3 days past his eating schedule, 3 days of slowly healing injuries with only the aid from his own skin and bones. Eating his own flesh was slowly starting to fail. His hunger quickly was growing stronger and stronger, locked in a room with only his childhood friend to keep him company. He was starting to get hungry, and that thought terrified Midoriya to his core, silently sat on the opposite side of the room to where Bakugo obliviously sat to the thought crawling in the back of his mind. They couldn't afford to stick around and wait for the heroes to rescue them, not anymore. Midoriya let out a ragged sigh as he felt his emotions begin to overwhelm him, causing Bakugo to look over to him curiously as he looked up from the blood surrounding him. His words were filled with caution. Deku? Midoriya gulped, his eyes widening with fear and anxiety. Kaken. I don't think eating my fingers is going to work much longer. The switch from curiosity to unbinding fear in Bakugo's eyes was instant as he sat up from the damp fall he leant against cautiously. Deku. What do you mean? Izuku let out a withered laugh of desperation. I'm starting to get hungry, Kaken, he began with a pitiful look as he looked up from his blooded fingers towards his blonde-haired classmate, his eyes brimming with an alarming look of hopelessness. I don't think we can wait until the heroes rescue you anymore, we need to find a way out ourselves. Bakugo leant back against the wall, his contemplating eyes still wide as he thought over the distressing words spoken by his friend, before letting out a ragged sigh and turning to face him somewhat annoyed. We're going to get out of this together, alright? Just try and hold yourself together while we find a way out. And stop with the depressing shit about the heroes not coming to save you too. It's really starting to get on my nerves. Midoriya sat up straight with a look of surprised shock, ignoring the lack of energy coming from his usually over-the-top angry displays. Why would the heroes want to come after me? Bakugo just narrowed his eyes as he looked at Midoriya's visibly exhausted and deteriorating body up and down as he gave a momentary pause. Of course they're going to come and find you, you stupid nerd. Midoriya stayed quiet as he gave out a silent gulp, listening to what Bakugo had to say. With the way the pink cheeks and icy hot were acting around you, it wouldn't surprise me if they've both already explained what you told me to the heroes. Izuku shot up from where he was slumped with fear and muted betrayal glistening over his face. What? No, they wouldn't do that. They both promised to keep everything a secret. Bakugo let out an infuriated groan. Of course they're gonna tell Sensei, you idiot. They fucking care about you and know that when we're getting out of here you're likely to go to fucking jail. It's disgustingly sappy. But it wouldn't surprise me if they told the heroes to try and keep you away from there. He leaned against the wall behind him, crossing his arms as he closed his eyes to rest them, the exhaustion of not sleeping for the last few days draining him by the second. The heroes aren't stupid, unlike some people around here, and will know that it was part of a situation you couldn't fucking control. So suck it up and stop moaning. I've already told you to stop once today, it's fucking depressing. Izuku silently watched as Bakugo looked as if he was about to drop off to sleep, his body seemingly fighting to stay awake. He couldn't believe how calm he was, lying there with his eyes closed while locked in a room with him. Wasn't he scared? Wasn't he afraid there was a chance he wouldn't wake up? Bakugo's eyes remained closed as he spoke up again, his voice much quieter than before as he silently yawned. Besides, you've still got one for all. I doubt All Might would let something like that go to waste. Izuku lowered his head with sorrow at the thought, even though it had already crossed his mind hundreds of times. I told you I intended to give it back to him, Izuku murmured out to himself before lifting his head to look at Bakugo with concern as a new thought washed over him. How can you sit there so calmly? Seconds ticked by before a response came. What do you mean by that? Izuku shifted awkwardly where he was sitting. How can you sit there in a room with me so calmly when I just said I was hungry? He watched as he saw a single eye open across the room, eyeing him with annoyance. What? Are you trying to say you want to eat me? Izuku visibly jerked back, waving his arms with denial in front of him. What? No. I'd never want to eat you. Bakugo watched him carefully for a moment before shutting his eye again, giving a content yet tired hum. Good. He paused again. I'd kill you before you had the chance anyway. Izuku felt his eyes widen with surprise at the answer, which would normally make him feel so uncomfortable before letting out a nostalgically quiet laugh, not noticing the small smirk hinting at the corners of Bakugo's mouth as he rested his head back against the wall. The pair fell into a comfortable silence, as comfortable as one could in the situation they were in. Izuku shifted awkwardly in his seat as he felt his stomach began to ache for food again, wincing at the pain as he slowly lifted his hand up to his mouth again and chewed down on his fingers again. The time between his stomach pains was rapidly shortening, leaving an uncomfortable twisted feeling lying deep within the pit of his stomach. Izuku wondered if Bakugo had even noticed. Hey Kaken? Izuku began quietly after a while, looking up to his blonde classmate who didn't bother opening his eyes as he gave a short hum in response. He lowered his head to look at his blood-stained hands as he spoke, memories of all the horrific things he had done flashing through his mind as he thought of the prospect of never getting out of here alive. In the end, if we can't escape together, I need you to promise to look after one for all for me. Izuku didn't notice Bakugo's eyes blinking open with surprise from his request. Deku, I told you to stop talking like that. He only lowered his head further with shame, reaching up to grab his head as he began to visibly shake. You've got a far better chance of getting out of this alive with one for all, I'd rather you take it. He hid his head within his tucked up knees, muffling his words. I don't think I could take it again if Al. Aizawa's final words were cut off by a loud bang of a door above them slamming open as the sounds of heavy, racing feet sprinted around above them. The noise made the pair of them jump with fear, petrified in their place, as adrenaline pumping through both of their bodies through their exhaustion and prepared them for whatever monster was quickly coming to get them. What the fuck was that? Bakugo whispered to himself aloud as he quickly stood up preparing for a fight. The two boys looked around the room for clues, only for the sounds to be followed by another loud bang. Much, much closer. A sharp intake of breath could be heard as Izuku pushed himself against a wall as terrified hysteria quickly came over him, his eyes visibly widening with fear. His world around him was starting to crumble away from beneath him, leaving him murmuring rapt pleas to the god he had offended that it wasn't all for one. Coming back for another attempt to claim one for all. He couldn't handle another round. It had been so long since the last one, he had grown almost complacent in the safety he had always felt near Bakugo. His thought trailed back to the agony he felt, violent memories of All for One's hand, lowering slowly onto his head before he was impaled with excruciating pain. The pain which came again and again and again, leaving him writhing on the floor with desperate gasps for air. The attacks knocked and overwhelmed all the senses in his body. He didn't want to cave in, but at this rate, he knew the possibility was far from within his control. He couldn't do that again, not again. Quickly, Izuku reached up and grabbed at his hair, the colorings now patchy from the splotch of pale hair, which had formed from the stress and fear created from the pain and torture he had endured from All for One, trying to make him give in and give the quirk back to him, and ripped a clump out. Kaken. Please. Take it. Bakugo turned at the sound of his nickname and looked down to the snot tear-ridden expression on his classmate's face. The expression leaving him mortified at the utter desperation in Midoriya's voice as he crawled towards him, begging to take ownership of the legacy bestowed upon him. Deku, stop. Calm down. Midoriya leant forward to grab a hold of the blonde's blood-spoiled trousers as he clawed himself up, the scene scarily reminiscent of a man clinging onto the edge of a cliff before ultimately falling to their deaths. You don't understand. I can't. He let out a ragged breath as Bakugo's eyes widened further with horror as he tried to grab hold of Midoriya's shoulders in an attempt to try and ground him, panic flaring into his voice. Deku. Can't wa. Hysterical giggles muffled through heavy breaths and snotty snorts rang throughout the room, echoing off the blood-stained walls as Izuku looked up to Bakugo with utter defeat, the clump of knotted hair still clinging tightly within his palm. I can't take any more. All for One is going to try and take one for all from me. I can't keep it anymore. Izuku took in a sharp breath through his sobs. I can't do this, you need to take it, it's not safe with me anymore. Bakugo felt his eyes widen with realization as he understood what Midoriya was trying to do, sucking in a steep breath as he felt his own emotions getting the better of him as his voice shook and tears of fear and anxiety began to make their way through his own eyes. Hey. You don't even know if it is all for one. He shucked in a deep breath of horror as he watched Midoriya's eyes slowly traverse the boundaries between what visibly made him into the ghoul he feared within himself. The heavy footsteps grew closer and closer as each of Midoriya's breaths came quicker by the second. Please. Kaken. Please take it. Please. It's not safe with me. Shared tears flew down either of their faces. I can't do this anymore. I don't want you to get hurt. The bangs on the floor were now on their floor. Stop it, Deku. As Midoriya's eyes came closer and closer to his target. I don't want you to get hurt. Use it to protect yourself, please. Getting more and more desperate. I don't need protection. I thought I told you that. We can fight them off together. As some sobs grew louder. I don't want to hurt you. Please. Others stayed steady and strong. You won't. A shout coming from a distance away was heard from outside the cell as the metal poles holding it shut from the inside began to shift, causing Izuku to fight against the restraints that Bakugo held him down with. A new wave of unpalatable pain clawed into his stomach. A pain starting to become far too much for any man to handle. Please just take it. Kaken. I don't want to eat you. As the next few tense sacred moments flew past, the iron door which had helped them captive flew open. A bright burning light from the other side shone into the sullen room as Midoriya and Bakugo's eyes flew straight to the figure who shadowed above them. Oh. He felt an overwhelming wave of hunger come over him as Midoriya's ghoulish eye locked onto the villain at the door. That wasn't all for one. Bakugo didn't have time to blink before he was shoved to the side, a large black tentacle, throbbing with pulsing red veins as Midoriya flew past him towards the villain now on the floor. It didn't take long for blood to pool into the room from the exit of the room. Chapter 36. Their only chance to escape. It took only a matter of seconds for Bakugo to realize what was occurring on the floor in front of him as Midoriya shoved past him to tackle the villain standing by the door to the ground. Deku was dismembering a villain. Deku was eating a living human. Shock manifested into horror as the blood and tissue flying away from the villain's retaliating body, leaving pools of blood slowly leaking into the cell. Bakugo's eyes widened with horror as his mind reeled back to the memories of Deku eating his own hand to preserve his hunger. The horribly disturbing habit he had scolded him for, which had held back the ferocious animal now decimating the villain before him. He didn't have time to think about it now, but the thought that Midoriya had chosen to eat his own hands over and over, instead of risking his life, scared him, no matter how much he would deny it. He had held himself back for Bakugo's safety and shoved him violently out of the way to let himself loose on the villain who had made the deadly mistake to open the cage door to a cannibal alone. It didn't take long for Bakugo to shake himself out of his horror as the sounds of the squelching of flesh and the lack of resistance came from the villain who laid motionlessly on the floor in a pool of their own blood. Midoriya ignored his presence as he edged his way out of the room, avoiding the splatters of blood which scattered the walls around them, not tempted to look down to the villain, as turned to run away and escape, calling for Midoriya to follow as he did so. Bakugo had only taken a few steps once he realized that Midoriya wasn't following him, coaxing him to turn around and lay his eyes on his classmates who were still devouring into the villain, shoveling handful after handfuls of flesh and meat into his mouth. The lifeless head rolled onto its side from the force Izuku was placing onto the body as Bakugo's eyes caught the villain's own, causing him to take a sharp intake of breath at the grotesquely morbid scene of death which ingrained itself into his mind. His voice shaking with distress as he crept horrifyingly away from the body. Bakugos's words slid from his mouth with a hiss, stressing his words as he stumbled on his words. Panic flooded into his body as Midoriya remained oblivious to the world around him, his concentration pinpointed into hollowing the carcass before him. Deku. Come on. We need to go. His words went ignored as Midoriya continued devouring the villain at a rapid pace, tearing chunk after chunk of flesh and blood into his mouth as quickly as humanly possible, uncaring for the reactions of his classmate watching him eat. Deku, stop it. We need to leave. Bakugo's words were only becoming more desperate by the second as Midoriya slowed down enough from his eating to utter a few words between mouthfuls. I can't. The blonde felt his eyes widen at the insanity of Isaacus's response. This was their chance to escape, and he was wasting every precious second which trickled past, staying behind to attack the villain who would no longer be able to chase them down. Bakugo knew for sure that it wouldn't be long until the rest of the villains came knocking to find their comrade dead on the ground, and he was certain they wouldn't be pleased. Infuriated anger raged beneath the overwhelming dread and hysteria. The blonde was desperately trying to constrain beneath his visibly frustrated face, his brows narrowing heavily as he growled out his agitations. What do you mean you can't? We need to get a move on and escape, not wait around here for the villains to find us. The world remained silent for a second before Izuku visibly slowed his pace, finally giving Bakugo the reasonable response he clearly didn't crave. I can't afford to. Bakugo took a step back as he began almost laughing from the insanity of it all, still baffled by his answer. What? Izuku didn't bother to look up at Katsuki as he shoveled another couple of handfuls of meat into his mouth, the action making Bakugo was to gag. I need to eat as much as possible, Kaken, Izuku muttered out dully. I need the energy to fight off anyone who will chase after us. He paused as he shoved another handful of flesh into his mouth before finally looking up at his classmate, his multicolored eyes dull and tired. There is no chance of us getting out of here without getting chased. If I don't eat we won't get far otherwise. Bakugo didn't bother challenging the subtle offhand remark about not being able to protect himself, only watching with a sickening gulp as Izuku continued devouring the dead body. His mind still releasing with the realization of how desperate Izuku must have been for food at the extent of the body which was already gone. How dangerously close he must have been to eating him, locked in that confined cell, together and alone with no one to hear him scream. He would never admit it aloud, but Bakugo knew now how his quirk worked and how difficult it would be to escape without the green-haired ghoul beside him. Bakugo knew he would never be able to leave him behind in that gloomy, malodorous cell. Unbeknownst to him, Midoriya was having the same dreaded thoughts as well, now having thankfully tamed the barely controllable urges swelling inside him. Their brief few seconds of unchallenged freedom were beginning to trickle away. Get away from her. Izuku was only halfway through the villain's torso when all of a sudden shouts of fury came tumbling down the corridor. The infuriated noises set the pair of hero students on edge, both of them snapping their heads behind them as they saw Compress run around the corner before sprinting down the corridor behind them. The villain's surprise appearance made the two boys freeze with panic before Bakugo jumped up and began running away at the sight of the blue marbles flying towards them. It only took a blink of an eye for Izuku to vanish from Bakugos's line of sight in front of him before reappearing next to Compress with vicious movement as he tore his arm off, avoiding all the marbles from his quick as he had rapidly approached him. Compress let out an unholy scream as the sound alerted the rest of the villains who were not far behind him, the missing limb thrown across the corridor as the masked villain leant down to grasp at his missing arm with gritted teeth, his blood mixing with magnes over the walls and floor. Deku. We need to leave. Bakugo's frantic yells called out as Izuku turned back to look at his whitened eyes, his classmate's voice distracting him from the cremation villain standing behind him. The blue flames which had tickled against the villain's hands exploded throughout the room towards them, coating Izuku who was closer to the villain in a wave of white sizzling agony, singeing away at his skin off before his quirk quickly replaced it. Bakugo, who was standing just far enough away to jump out of the villain's reduced range from the size of the corridor, leapt back and watched with jaw-dropped horror as the wall of cremating flames immersed his classmate, Izuku's screams overwhelmed by the roar of the flames. Deku. Bakugo's screams of fear were silenced by the wall of flames, Dabi hidden on the other side, grinning like a psychopath as the screams from within the fire vanished, his scarred hands up to control the flames all the while. He was too busy trying to prevent his healthy skin from singeing to react quick enough to the black-red vein tentacle of Izuku's Kagyun, which shot out like a missile as Midoriya used the villain's body to push himself out of the other side of the blue flames, simultaneously launching the burned villain back down the corridor with unfortunately minimal injuries. Bakugo's eyes widened with shock as Midoriya landed beside him, gasping for breath as the fire drained the oxygen from the air, his molten skin dropping off before being rapidly replaced by new flesh. It seemed as if his cannibalistic diet was already beginning to show its side effects in full force once again. With Midoriya struggling to get up off the floor as quickly as possible, no words were shared in the frantic attempts Bakugo took to grab at his classmate's boiling skin, pulling him up successfully as they continued running down the corridor. As soon Midoriya had gotten his footing, Bakugo let go of his hand as they increased the speed they were running down the corridor in an attempt to find any window to jump from. In the few vital seconds the flames had given them, the pair found their home stretch as they ran up a set of stairs towards a window which sat placed only meters in front of them. Unfortunately, they didn't take into account the maze of paths the villains could have taken to pass the wall of fire they left behind, as the leader of the League of Villains, Shigaraki, ran out of a nearby corridor behind them that they had only just passed. In the few seconds Midoriya had needed to re-heal from the damage caused by the fire-wielding villain, the regeneration had caused him to lag slightly behind as the pain caused him to stumble forward with grit in his teeth. Those few inches were all that was needed for Shigaraki to catch up and launch himself far enough to latch his uncovered hand onto Midoriya's calf as Bakugo reached the window just before him, smashing it with his hand as the quirk suppression cuffs they had placed on him previously were still fully activated. Midoriya let out an inhuman scream as the disintegration of Shigaraki's quirk settled itself deep within his skin, the scream drawing the undivided attention of Bakugo as he turned away from the open window to see his classmate getting dragged back down the corridor. Shigaraki let out an insane grin of success as he watched the terror on Bakugo's face pull on his distraught features as he called out desperately to his friend. Deku. The grinding of his teeth could be heard as he slammed his jaw shut after gasping in agony, only managing to grit a few words through his teeth as he used all his upper body strength to try and pull himself up and away from the strong grip around his leg. Just run. Shigaraki's eyes visibly widened at Midoriya's words, yanking him back towards him as he tightened his grip, causing Midoriya to slam his eyes shut as he tried to distract himself from the pain. No, you're not going anywhere. Midoriya grunted as he forcibly yanked back face down onto the ground, using the lack of excess pull space Shigaraki had to activate his Kagyun in a desperate attempt to loosen the villain's grip around his leg, the silent war of regeneration and disintegration raging between them. The force of the Midoriya attack wasn't enough. Shigaraki's head whipped back from the force of Izuku's assault, his grip holding true as he kept his grasp firm, but it gave Izuku enough time to force his body off the ground, lifting Shigaraki's grip with him as he pulled away. Within a matter of milliseconds, Shigaraki recovered and lurched his head back towards Midoriya as he aimed his other arm towards Izuku's face with a vile, malicious scowl glaring up at him. Izuku didn't have any more time to waste. It started with a crack, the internal structure of Izuku bones in the calf of his leg fracturing in half before the rest of the bone followed in shattering pieces. What the? Shigaraki words were cut short as Izuku watched a splatter of blood land on a shocked expression on the villain's face, the flesh of his calf splintering into fragments down the side, following the pattern his bone was making inside. The tiers of mangled flesh and disintegrating bone tore themselves apart as Izuku used the power of both his quirks in a mix of green lightning, flying blood, and insanity together to plummet Shigaraki in the face, sent the man flying away in writhing pain down the corridor. Shigaraki's hand was ripped from his leg as it convulsed and snapped back into place, stumbling away while gasping for air as limped dangerously towards Bakugo, concentrating all of his energy into healing the leg he had torn apart. The look of alarm and fright, clear as day on Bakugo's face, was the first thing Izuku saw as he quickly stumbled his way towards the window, desperately grabbing a hold of the blonde's arm as he yanked his classmate out of the window behind him. falling to the ground a few meters below before the pair running as fast as they could into the darkness of the night. Stomps of shoes and gasps of breathlessness vibrated through the stagnant nighttime air, Midoriya and Bakugo sprinting as fast as their bodies would carry them away from the place, which would surely bring them to an early demise. Adrenaline was pumping high after Izuku managed to break off the quirk cuffs on Bakugo wrists, which is quirk allowing them to jump across the moonlit skyline. Propelling explosions and strength-induced leaps with the aid of Izuku's Kagyun, giving them the edge they needed to get back to civilization as quick as they could, whichever direction that was. It wasn't long before their exhaustion settled in again as they ran further and further away from the villain's lair, Izuku keeping his sense of smell going to try and pick up on anyone following them. Thankfully, not a single soul had traced them to the police station the pair were standing before. As the pair slowed down and Bakugo began to march his way inside, Izuku hesitated, his Kagyun slowly dissipating into nothing behind him as he stared warily up at the tall building in front of them. His little awkward pause in his pace caught the attention of Bakugo, whose body was now visible from the luminescent lights coming from inside the police station. The blonde focused on his face, exhaustion and fatigue shining through his pale skin. "Deku, come on, we need to get inside." Bakugo spoke cautiously as Midoriya visibly gulped, his eyes widening awkwardly as he tried to mumble out his excuse. I need to find something to eat, my stomach is starting to hurt from all the healing." Izuku began, stumbling over his words as he winced with pain. A sharp pain making itself known down the bottom of his leg that Shigaraki had tried to destroy. "It's not safe for me to be near too many." "Holy shit, Deku, your leg." Bakugo's distressed words cut him off as he gasped again in pain, looking down to notice the bottom of his leg barely holding itself together as Shigaraki's disintegration carried on clawing deeply into him. The strong wave of adrenaline that had been numbing the pain falling away as the shooting pain down his calf hit him at full force as his body desperately tried to keep up with the rapid pace of the disintegration as it seemingly grew faster and faster. Or maybe it was his body running out of food. Izuku's leg began to crumple below him as he fell to the ground, his body slowly losing its battle as he looked in horror at the flakes of dead skin falling off his legs in front of him, the decay slowly crawling higher up his leg. He sucked in a deep, pained breath. "Deku." Within a matter of moments, Bakugo was beside him, panic and desperation for help were clear on his face as his hands hovered over Izuku's legs, stumped with no idea how to slow the villain's quirk down. "Fucking hell, it's spreading. Shit. Deku, I don't know how." His hands subconsciously lowered closer to Midoriya's leg as the green-haired boy noticed what Bakugo was unknowingly doing. "Kaken, stop." Izuku's words came out in a sudden scream, causing Katsuki to flinch away at the unexpected noise, his hands lifting away from the dying leg. Bakugo looked like he was about to start yelling angrily at the sudden noise when Izuku quickly butted in. "You can't touch it." Izuku began with wide-eyed alarm. "I don't want it to spread to you." Bakugo's eyes widened simultaneously with his words with a gulp, watching Izuku breath heavily in and out as he fell into a panicked frenzy, his shoeless foot falling apart into nothing as it crumbled out of existence. His friend who had been kidnapped and held hostage together with him and is probably the only reason Bakugo knew he was alive, was quickly disappearing before his eyes. At this rate, Izuku was slowly reaching his end. "Deku." How Bakugo began with a terrifying panic for his friend's safety as rare tears bloomed in his eyes as he brought his hands up to grab at his hair as he looked down at Izuku's missing foot. "How do we stop this?" Izuku didn't respond, pushing Bakugo away forcefully with his arm as he sat up, bringing his other arm into his mouth before biting down forcefully. Bakugo rolled slightly away before he stopped, his head shooting in Deku's direction as he watched with alarm what he assumed was Izuku trying to gain more energy through eating his own flesh once again. Except, Izuku never pulled his flesh away, leaning forward as he activated a single Kagyun from behind his back before slicing through the fortunately decay-free flesh of his thigh. The arm in his mouth muffling the agonizing screams which still managed to vibrate through the tight grip Izuku held it in, white pain searing through him like a bolt of lightning. Bakugo's incoherent screams in the background of his mind were muted by the deafening sensations he felt raging throughout his body. "Deku." He dismembered his leg off in a single slice, stopping the spread of Shigaraki's quickly in its place. Aizawa's Kagyun dissipated into nothing as he flopped onto his back, gasping for air as he tried to mute the pain. "Deku." His senses were too warped to notice the new figures and people standing around him, The sounds of shouts and screams muffled around him as he shakily tried to push himself back up onto his arms. Back. His eyesight was too blurred to notice the small swarm of police officers charging out of the building, quinks raised, or the two officers holding Bakugo back as they attacked him as he tried to stand, only to be knocked back onto the ground in an instant. Frantic cries could be heard as he managed to make out one of the figures getting dragged away, Bakugo's face slowly coming back into focus for only a moment as his fearful eyes screamed out to him. Deku. That was the last thing he heard before his lights went dark and his slumber called him back to sleep. It all happened so quickly, and Bakugo watched hysterically as it all unfolded before him. In a matter of moments, Izuku's leg was dismembered from his body with a sickening quelch from his activated quirk. The police from inside the station, making themselves known as his Kagyun, vanished into nothing. Izuku's leg fell into dust, no longer having the fuel source it needed to continue regenerating as it disappeared with the breeze of the police rushing past him, weapons raised to attack. There was nothing Bakugo could do but watch with Apple. Two police officers came up behind him in some kind of attempt to get him away from his classmate as they hit him violently with the tools which looked so similar to tentacle that Midoriya could control. The pair of them both too exhausted and drained to resist. No. Deku. He struggled against their hold pathetically, Midoriya now lying motionlessly on the ground as he was dragged into the police station, kicking and screaming profanities as he went. Why were they attacking him out of nowhere? Couldn't they see that Deku wasn't trying to harm him? The possibilities of what knowledge the police had about Izuku and his quirks made Bakugo freeze with fear as his world seemed to blur as well, too deep in his thoughts to notice the people rushing around and the two police officers trying to talk to him. Had they seen Midoriya's eye? Had they been unfortunate enough to spot the Kagyun? Which had vanished only a few seconds before the officers had even left the building. Seconds trickled into minutes, and only after a matter of moments did Aizawa, trailed by All Might and Nezu, come hurrying through the door, Aizawa splitting off from the others once he spotted Bakugo weakly protesting against a police officer's tight hold, lost within his own mind. It was only after Aizawa-sensei spoke that his thoughts snapped back to the present, looking up at him in shock and relief. Hey. Let go of him. I'll take it from here. The two police officers loosened their grips as they looked at each other with a nonchalant shrug, giving Bakugo the opportunity to shake himself free of their holds. Fuck. Bakugo cursed quietly, falling into a sitting position on the floor, Aizawa quickly following him down in a kneel as he held onto Bakugo's shoulders and quickly checked him over with wide and worried eyes. Bakugo. Are you alright? What happened? How did you escape? His sensei's words were coming out in Spitfire in an oddly out-of-character yet comforting way, Bakugo holding back a silent cry as he gritted his teeth in a grin, his eyes betraying him as strained tears rolled down their indented tracks. Bakugo wasn't thinking straight enough to answer his questions, too focused on his worries for Midoriya. I should have died. Aizawa flinched back with a heavy gasp, eyes whitening with concern as he misinterpreted Bakugo's words. Bakugo, it's not your. Bakugo stumbled over his words, whispering them seemingly to himself as he interrupted his sensei. If Deku hadn't been there without him, there's no way I would have made it out alive. Aizawa slowly let go of Bakugo's shoulder with a quiet gasp of shock before he pulled himself out of his shock and grasped Bakugo's shoulders once again, grounding the blonde back to reality, finally coherent enough to understand his sensei's questions as he started up at him lethargically. Aizawa felt a wave of confusion and concern fall over him, his expression growing fearful as he looked into the exhausted and dull red eyes of his student, slightly jogging the blonde for an answer. Bakugo, what are you talking about? Bakugo didn't blink as he stared up at his sensei, jaw open before gulping, as he slowly gathered what Aizawa was asking. What happened to you two? His silence was soon replaced with a quiet chuckle mixed sloppily with his growing sobs of anguish, verging on the edge of hysterical, as he replied. He was eating his own hands. His own fingers. Bakugo lowered his head into his shaky hands as his eyes remained wide. He choked on his words as he sucked in a sharp, ragged breath, his words horribly strained and throat itchy and dry from his screams of anger and terror earlier. He ate his own flesh and blood to stop himself from getting hungry, to stop himself from eating me. He shoved me aside and took on the entire League of Villains, while I couldn't access my quirk because of the cuffs they had put on my wrists. Aizawa steadily grew pale as Bakugo continued replaying his memories, opting to pull the hysterically crying boy into a hug of safety as words kept pouring from the traumatized blonde's mouth. The action of the last few days finally catching up with him and hitting reality. They had locked us in a room together for hours and he was starving, but he didn't once hurt me. Bakugo turned into his teacher as he grabbed a hold of Aizawa's hero uniform in a rare show of weakness and insecurity. He took every hit the villains sent at us just to give us a chance to escape. His words finished up as his fatigue finally caught up with him, his final words going silent and unsaid within his mind. He took every hit just to save me. Chapter 37. Interrogations. It had taken him a while to listen to the terrors Bakugo had faced before calming him down enough to quickly leave and call his parents to the station. With Midoriya unconscious and locked with a quirk-proof cell, the police officers, Nezu and Detective Tsukauchi, were led into an interview. Aizawa lingered in the back of the room as they questioned Bakugo again, with his parents by his side, on the events of the week, this time Tsukauchi's quirk recording each answer as truth. It was completely heart-wrenching to hear, listening to his brave student tear up over his traumatic experiences twice within the same day, leaving Aizawa grimacing again as he stuck through and listened to it all again, in some attempt to be a familiar face to the Bakugos. In their unfamiliar situation. What about Midoriya? What's going to happen to him? The young Bakugo's words were painful to listen to, as he distraughtly asked what was going to happen to his green-haired classmate. Aizawa was grateful that Nezu had replied and told him that they were going to try and keep Midoriya safe and secure at UA, the weight of the world seemingly dropping off the child's back, leaving only his traumas and mental anguish to rest, at least for now. After the interview was over, the Bakugoses went home, Aizawa notifying them about the dorm visit the school would be having in the coming week to talk about the dorms, leaving the UA staff and police to discuss the final factors of Izuku's fate. I don't believe we need to worry about Midoriya trying to resist the conditions he will have to follow during his stay at UA. Nezu began, addressing a police officer's concerns about the possibilities of Midoriya trying to escape. However, I do believe he may become a bit of a flight risk. Not in terms of causing more harm to people around him, but more towards himself. A few faces around the room grimaced at the uncomfortable possibilities. They didn't need to be reminded of Midoriya's personality to know the guilt and shame of the violent acts he had committed would constantly weigh heavily on his mind. Midoriya had the heart of a hero, and the weight of all the death he must have been dragging heavily behind him. Anyone with any common sense would realize, even though the situation was deadly unfavorable, Midoriya had done what he needed to do to survive and to protect the people around him. No matter how much pressure insolent and uninformed people put on them, they couldn't fault him for that. I have no doubt that being placed under so many restrictions and banning him from his core hero lessons to avoid quirk usage until we can find a sustainable food source for him will take its toll on him. Nezu continued on, we will certainly need to keep an eye on him. Aizawa nodded with agreement from where he was sitting, tucked up within one of his many yellow sleeping bags, as he leapt forwards to give his response. I agree, Midoriya is a strong-willed student. The amount of stress and trauma he's been through in just the last few days alone would be enough to make even some heroes go insane and quit. He began, drawing the attention of the people around the room. The new white patches of hair on his head already show the physical signs of deep-laid trauma and stress. A few silent nods were shared around the room as Aizawa lowered his gaze down to the paperwork on the table in front of him, thinking back to notes already given to them. The spread of the patches has slowed thankfully, but it's vital that we keep a close watch on his mentality to keep him and the others who will be around him safe. He paused for a moment as he remembered the details Bakugo had given him. Although I have no concerns about him possibly attacking his classmates when he didn't lay a finger on Bakugo while they were held hostage by the League, and considering the situation, I feel like if he was ever to even accidentally harm someone, he would have done it then. One of the police officers, who were clearly skeptical of their ideas, spoke up cautiously. But how do you know Bakugo wasn't lying to keep his classmates safe? Are you sure it's a good idea to keep Midoriya with all the other UA students? I mean, with all of the restrictions put in place, aren't you worried it will be too much for him and make him lash out at his classmates? Aizawa narrowed his eyes. I feel that it's quite unjustified to compare him to some psycho in a mental hospital, officer. He risked his livelihood coming to train to be a hero at UA, with the quirk he was unfairly given. He had every chance to join the League of Villains and work for them, and so far we have no evidence that points to his cooperation with the League. He came back to us willingly, knowing the consequences he would face. The officer visibly grimaced at Aizawa's harsh words as Tsukauchi quickly spoke up to ease the tension which was quickly forming around the erasure hero. During the interview with the Bakugo family, everything young Bakugo-san said registered as true. I can confirm that Midoriya never once harmed Bakugo during their captivity together. Tsukauchi began in an even tone. Furthermore, I was also able to confirm that Midoriya was the only reason they were able to escape, both relatively unharmed during the time they were able to leave, even while, according to Bakugo, so hungry he was resorting to eating his own flesh to prevent harm to his classmate. Deep intakes of shocked breath could be heard around the room from the graphic words the detective had described, the few who were already informed of the ordeal only grimacing in response. The room fell silent for a moment before Nezu moved on to reassure the officer that his concerns weren't necessary. With the new protocol which is currently being put into place to accommodate Midoriya's eating arrangements and to take extra precautions for his own health and others, he won't be allowed off the school premises and will have to be supervised while eating every day to ensure he keeps his hunger down. Nezu lowered his head as agreements filled the room, lowering his voice as he spoke to himself. Although, once he has woken up, we need to conduct an interview and discuss something. I still need to ask him where he was able to source his food from for the last 2 months, since neither of his friends is willing to give up answers. And Bakugo didn't even know of Midoriya's secondary quirk until their summer camp. A few murmurs were spread around the room as All Might, now out of his hero costume and in his civilian clothes, awkwardly cleared his throat to raise his own concerns as the people around the room turned to look at him. Has his mother been made aware of the situation? Young Midoriya has a strong connection with his mother, is she going to be allowed to see him? Nezu grimaced of All Might's words, thinking back to the conversation he had held with Midoriya's mother at their home residence. It took us a while to convince her, but we've informed her of Midoriya's unfortunate situation, and as to be expected, she didn't take it too well. A few weary winces were shared around the room at the thought of Midoriya's mother, learning that her son was the ghoul which had haunted the streets of Musatafu for villains over the last year or so. Mrs. Midoriya seemed rather against allowing him to continue his education here at UA, to keep him safe and away from UA and its residents, however. She seemed more adamant of her decision after we had informed her of the effects his quirks had on his hunger and how affected his mental state as well, all the while getting his food delivered to their address. Nezu let out a defeated sigh as he carried on speaking, looking down to the list of information he had available to him on the table below. Unfortunately for her, there are a lot of things which won't be possible under Midoriya's new restrictions. However, she is more than able to come and visit her son on school grounds whenever she may like. Along with that, he will not be participating in any of the core heroic lessons until we can ensure his new diet is working. He looked back towards the police officer who had spoken up earlier, speaking confidently and determinedly as he did so. The police and I have worked hard to keep this all highly confidential, however, there are many people still working in the task force who would like to see Midoriya behind the bars of Tartarus. He paused momentarily, looking around the room towards the rest of his staff looking towards him for answers and a direction to walk in. Therefore, to keep as many people happy as possible, while abiding by some of the same restrictions that jail presents, Midoriya will not be allowed off the UA school campus at any point until he is deemed stable and trustworthy enough to be given permission to leave for extra school activities and supervised home visits, which will work in our favor as we keep him under observation for the time being. Nisa's statement was final. Leaving the few teachers who had been able to come to the police station at such short notice, and the officers and detective who had been called in last minute, all understood and agreed with the decisions made to keep Midoriya safe and the people around him. Their meeting was slowly coming to a close. Aizawa decided to add his own input to confirm Nisa's plan of action for the few unsure people within the room. These final decisions won't take place until we have interrogated Midoriya himself. We'll need to ensure that he wasn't working with the League and need to know his intentions first before we place him in UA. He began, the rest of the staff looking towards him. All arrangements are standing on how Midoriya responds during his interrogate. A bang from the door fling open caught the heroes of officers around the room by surprise, the noise cutting off Aizawa's speech as they all looked over to see who had barged into the room. An officer, with whitened eyes, stood by the door, staring towards Nezu as he quickly spoke. Midoriya's woken up. All Might and Aizawa lurched forward, eyes widened, from their seats and stood up as the rest of the people around the room followed them not far behind. What? The officer nodded urgently, grimly furrowing his brows as he spoke. His limbs which were bleeding have healed into stumps, but it seems as if he doesn't have the energy to regenerate his leg back, and he's refusing to drink the blood packets we threw in the room with him. Aizawa felt himself and the few of the others around him grimace, the police officer visibly on edge as he looked unsure about what to do. He's been out under quirk suppressors since we brought him in, but no one has gotten permission to enter his cell till recently. The police department are putting together a group in specialized kit to force feed him. Aizawa's brows shot up, All Might's expression not far behind, as they stood in shock at the officer's words. Force feeding? The officer winced as Aizawa's words came out harsher than intended, the underground hero in shock at the idea. If we don't force feed him, or at least get him to eat himself, the likelihood of him being kept here longer than necessary will increase. He began, the rational side of Aizawa's personality stepping forward as he quickly began to understand the officer's reasoning. The quirk restricting cuffs is causing him pain and can't be taken off until the interrogation is complete. We need to get it done as quickly as possible so he can be transported to UA where it is more secure. Whether they meant it was more secure for their own safety or Midoriya's, Aizawa was too tired to find out as his narrowed eyes softened wearily. Letting out a sigh of exhaustion, he turned to look behind him where All Might was standing with a worried expression. Fine, Aizawa began, turning back to the officer as he quickly began walking towards the door before turning back to beckon Yagi to follow him. Come on, let's help get this interrogation moving. If anyone can get Midoriya to listen, it's you. All Might stood tall in his hero form as he nodded silently, quickly stepping behind Aizawa as they hurried out the room towards where Midoriya was being held. The rest of the members of the meeting followed not far behind. It didn't take long for them to hear the incessant crying coming through the speakers, his boy curled up against the wall as he clenched at his stomach, the blood pouches scattered over the floor as if they had been thrown in. Aizawa cringed at the sight through the one-way mirror which separated them, the power of the quirk-canceling cuffs having a much dire effect on him than originally anticipated, as memories that had hidden themselves beneath the surface came to light. The similarities between the behavior displayed now and the time he had managed to use his erasure quirk on, the night he got the second scar on his cheek as he had chased his scared student across the city's skyline. Watching his student crying in pain before he hurt. Aizawa was sure he wasn't the only one who felt guilty watching on without being able to do anything about it at that moment, if All Might's unusually fidgety stance meant anything. One of the officers who had been watching over Midoriya for the last few hours walked over and handed Aizawa a microphone, his expression clearly bored from waiting for Midoriya to stop crying and do as they asked. The chief wants to interrogate him soon, but we can't do that until he's healed and calmed down enough for Tsukauchi to confirm that he won't attack us or anyone else who enters his cell. The officer let out a tired sigh as if he thought the whole situation was too bothersome to deal with. Just try and get him to drink something. We haven't got any of his food currently, so he's just going to have to suffer for the moment. Aizawa paused as he looked at the microphone getting shoved towards him, unsure about whether he was truly the best person for the job, knowing full well he wasn't partially a comforting person. He cringed at the thought, subtly turning back to where All Might stood tall behind him, subtle beckoning the hero forward to take the microphone for him, knowing that Midoriya and All Might had a far better relationship than he'd ever have with his students. No matter how much the number one hero chose to deny his favoritism. All Might looked down at the underground hero as he gave him the beckoning side-eye before grimacing and shaking his head as he saw Aizawa's eyes widen with surprise. All Might sighed slightly as he thought of Midoriya's reaction would be once he learned his idol was on the other side of the wall whilst he was sitting in his jail cell. Yagi knew Midoriya looked up to him, he knew the lengths Midoriya would go to prove himself worthy of holding the power of One for All. But he was also the number one hero, a hero well-renowned across the world for his career in creating Japan's low villain rate, and Midoriya knew that. Yagi knew that Midoriya had been put in a situation where he was forced to commit the crime he had for the sake of people he cared about, for the sake of his own survival. However, he also knew the great weight Midoriya must have been carrying over his head, the guilt and shame the boy would allow to manifest within himself because of the deeds he had committed, and looking at the sorry state the boy was in now, there was no way he would forgive himself easily. Let alone All Might would. With that being said, he didn't think he would be the best person to talk to Midoriya until the news of freedom back to UA and the UA staff's understanding and sympathy of the situation had been made clear. I think it would be better if you spoke to him, Aizawa-san. I don't think hearing the voice of the number one hero while sitting in a jail cell is going to bring him much comfort. Aizawa nodded slowly before turning back to the officer to take the microphone from his hand, carefully not knocking it until he stood right in front of the glass, peering into the room as he spoke. praying Midoriya would recognize his voice through the static speaker. "Midoriya?" Aizawa felt the eyes of the occupants of the room fall upon him, his grasp on the microphone clenching tightly as he called out Midoriya's name to try and catch his attention. There wasn't much of a reaction, Midoriya only shifting slightly as he curled further into himself, leaving Aizawa grimacing at the thoughts that could have been raging through that poor boy's mind. But that small movement was enough for Aizawa to know Midoriya was listening loud and clear, giving Aizawa a rush of relief he didn't know he needed as he leant forward to speak into the microphone again. At least his student was still coherent enough to hear him. "Midoriya, I need you to listen to me," he began, his eyebrows narrowed seriously as he spoke, desperately hoping that his student would listen to his familiar voice. Midoriya shifted again, slowly turning his head around to look over towards the speaker, the one-way mirror, as tears that had been trailing down his face came into view. His single blood-red iris visible, as his hunger forced its activation through the quirk suppressors which clawed at his stomach, giving Aizawa and All Might a chance to see Midoriya's Ghoul identity clear in the light for the first time. Aizawa swallowed down the uncomfortable lump in his throat as he continued on, peering down onto Midoriya, trying to keep a professional stance in front of the officers around the room as he spoke. "Midoriya, we're here to interrogate you for your connections to the League of Villains and the crimes you have committed over the last 17 months. Aizawa began seriously, before letting out a strained breath at the terrified sight of his student as Midoriya rolled back over away from them. "We have reason to believe that the crimes you committed were not done willingly, even if you were forced by your own hand." Aizawa paused as he let his words sink in. "We need you to cooperate with us so we can prevent the worst possible outcome from happening." Midoriya's future had already been decided, but as much as Aizawa hated to admit it, it was best to keep that from him as long as possible. There was always a chance he was working with the League of Villains. Even with Tsukauchi's quirk, Midoriya was incredibly smart, avoiding police capture for so long. There was always the possibility of Midoriya finding a way around it. Aizawa looked back around the room at all the eyes watching intently through the window before turning back as he felt his demeanor soften. "Midoriya, you're very lucky to have such loyal friends who care about you so much. We want to try and help you as much as possible, but we can't unless you cooperate with us. If you refuse to eat, you'll have to remain in solitary confinement until you die from starvation." It was harsh, but Aizawa knew that Midoriya needed to be told the truth and understand the reality of the situation he was in. He released his finger from the microphone as he cancelled out the connection to the speakers, watching silently as Midoriya jolted slightly at the mention of his friends as All Might stepped up beside him. Both watching silently as Midoriya slowly began to move from the protective position he was laying in. "You've done well, Aizawa-san." All Might began after a while. Aizawa nodded slightly as he lowered his head into his capture weapon, not bothering to reply as they watched Midoriya reach over hesitantly towards one of the blood pouches before rolling back guiltily away, prompting the police officers on the other side of the glass to start preparing for the interrogation. It was a start, at least. A start to a long road ahead of them. Midoriya had been through enough drama to last over multiple lifetimes, and yet from his actions during the training camp and what his friends said was true, his heart seemed to still be full of gold. Aizawa could only hope Midoriya would be able to follow the road far enough to become the hero he knew his student could be. The world came back to Midoriya slowly, firstly the lights, then the sounds. Finally, it was the pain, oh god, the pain. He felt as if he was 5 seconds away from starving to death as agony rippled through his body like lightning, his stomach feeling as if it was being torn out from his stomach. His screamed cries of pain rippled throughout the room as his blurred eyesight slowly came back to him through the rivers of tears trailing down his cheeks. It took a while for his coherent thoughts to make their way through the screams in his mind, slowly remembering the ordeals which had occurred and the situation he had landed himself in. He was in a jail cell. He had finally been caught. Izuku felt his tears trail across his face as he laid flat on the ground, looking around the bare room. The single blinding light on the ceiling along with the mirror opposite him, the only things preventing him from seeing the eerie similarities between here at the dingy cell all for one, had kept him hostage in. He let out a strained gasp as he felt all the stress and anxiety which had built up over him over the last year come crashing down, his chest hurting as his heart began to play up from the lack of oxygen entering his body. Tears rolled down his face harshly as he rolled over to face the wall, blocking out the blinding light from his eyes as he snapped them shut, only his back left facing the white wall behind him, coughing out cries and splutters as he did so. Izuku brought his hands up to his face as he dug his fingers into his jaw. With the agony from his stomach and his anguish attacking his mind, Midoriya felt as if his world was on fire, his lungs burning and body shaking as tears trickled onto his fingertips, leaving him trying to calm his rapid breath. It was only after his tears began to slow down that he noticed the intense scarring from his fingers reaching down to his knuckles from the repetitive self-mutilation he had participated in, the sight of his marred skin, leaving his gasping his shock and horror. His fingertips covered his bright pink, fresh scarring. Izuku lurched back at the sight, remembering the sorry state his leg had been in after Shigaraka's quirk had destroyed it, before shifting in a way that revealed his leg to him. Or well, what was left of it, as the destroyed skin of his lower leg from his knee was missing, leaving only a ghastly stump of pink tender skin in its place. Izuku felt his eyes widen in horror, his leg had not regenerated back. He lay frozen at a loss for what to do, his palms holding the remains of his leg as closely as he could as he thought of the possible whys to this situation. It was hard to tell he was truly starving with the quirk suppression cuffs taunting and overruling his senses. He laid like this for what seemed like hours, his overwhelmed senses clawing at the front of his mind as he bawled carelessly aloud for all in that tiny room to hear, his cries ringing out past the door and down the corridor as his teachers unknowingly arrived on the other side of the glass. Only visibly flinching as a few packets of what he could smell as human blood was thrown into the room and onto the floor behind him, causing him to curl up further within himself as he felt the overwhelming feelings of shame and guilt overcome him. Knowing that this was real and that the people waiting on the other side of that door knew exactly the kind of monster he was. Izuku curled into himself further, clamping his eyes shut. He could only hope they wouldn't make him wait too much time before they put him out of his misery. The static of a speaker starting made him jump, eyes wide as he froze in place as a familiar voice came rattling throughout the room. "Midoriya, I need you to listen to me." Izuku felt his eyes widening further, shock and fear filling his petrified core as he felt the overwhelming feeling of guilt and despair overcome him. His sensei watched his pathetic state, knowing the kind of monster he had become, how unworthy he was of becoming a hero, knowing the betrayal and pain he had caused. "Midoriya, we're here to interrogate you for your connections to the League of Villains and the crimes you have committed over the last 17 months. Izuku wasn't surprised they thought he had been working with the League, even if they were wrong, but at least it looked like his time was quickly coming to a close. Chapter 38. Reunions. The interrogation was far from what Izuku had anticipated, his sensei's otherworldly words still swirling unbelievably in his mind. The blood pouches they had thrown in with him were shamefully good, as he drank from them facing away from what he now realized was a one-way mirror, where he assumed Aizawa-sensei was stood watching him, along with whoever else was standing beyond the door. "Midoriya, you're very lucky to have such loyal friends who care about you so much." Izuku had cringed at his words, the thought that his friends had possibly risked their placement at UA for his sake. What had his friends confessed to the authorities? What had they done to make Aizawa-sensei say that? "We want to try and help you as much as possible, but we can't unless you cooperate with us. If you refuse to eat, you'll have to remain in solitary confinement until you die from starvation." It wasn't long after he had hesitantly drunk all the blood pouches, with some encouragement from Aizawa to push him through his own disgust and self-hatred, that a second unknown voice rattled through the speakers, installing weary fear into his soul. "Midoriya, my name is Tsukauchi, I believe we may have met or not before. I need you to answer a few questions before our interrogations begin." Midoriya had shifted awkwardly as he had turned to sit up, his sunken tired eyes slowly looking up towards the mirror as he had replied. "All right." He had answered a few questions honestly before the speakers shut off, and a few officers walked into the room, along with Aizawa-sensei not far behind. Midoriya had felt his eyes widen with surprise seeing him enter the room, even after hearing his voice through the speaking before lowering his head shamefully as he came face to face with his sensei. The questions which followed carried on and on for hours as he answered everyone as honestly and truthfully as he could, not bothering to keep back any details now as he told them in depth about the night his friend had attacked and tried to kill him. There was no point anyway, he was caught. When the topic of the League of Villains and his association came up, Izuku wasted no time confessing to the police about Hagakure's involvement and the information leaks she had committed, which had resulted in the attacks on the USJ and the summer training trip. It was only as he was confessing his knowledge of the spy to his sensei's face did he feel the drowning emotions of guilt and shame. Seeing up and close in person the damage he had caused on his sensei's cheek and withholding information on who had leaked the information which had caused the other scar under his eye and the pain she had caused to all of his classmates. It made him feel horrible, leaving him asking himself why couldn't he have just confessed and prevented all this in the first place every time he looked up into Aizawa-sensei's tired, saddened eyes. It wasn't until a few days later, when he was back in the dorms, that he was told that Hagakure had already fled and not returned to UA. The police who had been behind the one-way glass quickly launched an arrest warrant as Tsukauchi had given the signal for Midoriya's claim to be true, only to find the girl already long gone. That information had not gone down well with Izuku, leaving him feeling even more bitter and sick in the stomach. Exhaustion dragging though his head as the interrogation slowly came to a close, distracting himself trying to guess the detective's quirk, who sat beside his sensei to ask the time. It took a few hours for him to come to a reasonable conclusion, a truth quirk, and it was probably the only reason why they were interrogating him at that moment and accepting his truthful answers without any comment. The sudden thought had caused him to tense up slightly as he had eyed the detective, scared and curious about why he hadn't called him out about the origins of his original quirk once he asked him about his Ghoul quirk and how it worked. If he was going to comment on it, Izuku supposed, he already would have called him out about it. All he was worried about was how he was going to face All Might and give up the power of One for All. "Thank you for being honest with us," Midoriya the detective had begun, as he had started packing up his paperwork as he offered Midoriya a smile. The comment made Izuku feel far more relieved than he should have, considering the terrifying situation he was still stuck in. Too soon it felt as if the interrogation had come to a close. Aizawa offered Midoriya a chance to ask his own questions in a tone which was far too kind for a monster like him, which he almost declined before hesitating and opening his tired jaw to ask. His dark eyes and sunken facial features, from the lack of food, broke Aizawa's heart as he peered up at him. Am I going to prison? Midoriya could only watch Aizawa's eyes widen slightly with shock as he sat in his place, feeling so small and insecure, as his sensei offered him a relieving no. Izuku had dragged out a long sigh as the answer filled his mind with relief before asking, pausing into a momentary silence, thankful that he would have a chance to give All Might back the power he held. Sucking in a sharp breath as he asked the two men if it was possible for him to talk to his number one hero. Aizawa and Tsukauchi had shared a look of surprise as Midoriya's dark circles eyes peered up to them desperately as they stood up to leave him in the plain room again. Aizawa had grimaced a little, knowing that Yagi would have heard his student's words as he stood feet away behind him as he gave Midoriya an agreeing nod. "All right, I'll ask him for you." And that was all Midoriya could ask for, letting out a sigh of relief as he slumped back into the chair he was sat in, the tension from his body draining out before another thought had popped into his head. He hadn't considered whether All Might would even want to see him. Izuku grimaced in thought, he could only hope his mentor didn't hate him for the crimes he had committed enough to not even want to look at him. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but the horrible possibility certainly wasn't out the window. Izuku could only hope that even if All Might was infuriated out of his mind, as long as Midoriya had a chance to give back One for All, that's all that mattered to him. "You heard him, Yagi. He wants to see you." The room behind the one-way mirror had slowly emptied over the course of the interview, leaving only Yagi and his deflated form alone in the dim room, looking into the interrogation room at the successor he cared so deeply about. Bakugo and Midoriya had both been missing for 3 days, each with their own injuries and mental scars to heal from. Now they had made their own way back home to safety. Yagi lowered his head with guilt and shame, thinking back to their failed attempt to rescue the boys, only to come back empty-handed. The word Shigaraki had spoken in those few hours between the raid and the phone call he had received of their escape was still haunting him deep in the back of his mind. He could only remember feeling grief so strong once in his lifetime before, the memory of his own mentor flashing before his mind as he watched his own successor fidget awkwardly in his seat as if the poor boy would vanish before their eyes. It already looked as if part of the boy he had once known was missing from inside the exhausted child in front of them. The dark circles, extensive scars on his fingers and missing limb broke Yagi's heart to witness, leaving the hero praying that the kind-hearted, heroic boy was still strong enough to face his fight back to recovery. It would be a long, tough journey Midoriya would have to take, but this time Yagi had no intention of letting the boy walk the long, narrow line alone again. The thought brought him back to the present as he stared in disbelief as he heard the words calling for him fall from Midoriya's mouth, just as Aizawa and Tsukauchi walked out of the room leaving the boy behind. Yagi looked over to his co-worker, looking for confirmation as Tsukauchi gave him the all clear as he peered over to the hero, besides who gave him a subtle nod as he spoke. "We were right, Yagi." Midoriya told his friends the truth. He's never been affiliated with the Leave. The second wave of relief drained all the tension remaining in Yagi's body, slumping as all the fear and worry for his successor drained away as he peered back at the boy sitting alone. Yagi could only hear his heart thumping erratically as his sole concentration was dedicated to the poor green-haired boy curled back up into himself on the bench, his tufts of white hair poking out in odd places as he shifted in his seat. He had thought that all this time Midoriya would have resented him for not being able to see the issues which he had lurking beneath the surface, or that the poor boy would have been afraid of him because of his hero status. He thought Midoriya may have assumed he despised him for the actions he had taken with his own hands, but Yagi knew that heart was pathetically soft for the boy, and the bond he shared with his successor made it impossible for him to do or say anything that would draw hate. No matter the rumors or gossip shared, there had never been a moment that Yagi had believed that he worked for the League. He'd trusted his successor with his life's legacy, and he had never doubted his decision. Even with the Ghoul quirk Midoriya had kept hidden, he knew the power he possessed, and the actions it forced him to take wasn't his fault. Yagi just wished that Midoriya had trusted him enough and had spoken to him soon. He wouldn't deny that the secrets that had been kept from him didn't hurt, but he wasn't stupid enough not to realize the fear and anxiety his student must have been battling on his own. He just hoped Midoriya wasn't asking for him for the sole purpose of seeing his own intentions with him. Whether Midoriya was asking for him for alternative reasons or not, at least this was an opportunity for him to reassure the boy that all fears and doubts he had for him were all unwarranted. Yagi stifled a sigh, taking a deep shaken breath as he walked over to the door beside the mirror, looking at Aizawa, who offered him a nod as he walked into the room. It was a lot warmer than he had expected it to be, the bright lights on the ceiling causing his eyes to burn at their intensity a little as he quickly closed the door behind him, the sound catching Midoriya's attention as his face shot up from where it was resting. The green-haired boy's widened eyes watched him intensely as his small, less intimidating form stood on the opposite side of the room before looking down shamefully and lowering his face into his crossed arms as he muttered something out, fresh tears clearly falling from his eyes. "I'm sorry, I am so sorry, All Might, oh my god. I can't tell you how sorry I am." His successor's sobs broke Yagi's heart, the older man feeling his face crumple with mirroring sorrow as the poor boy clearly worked himself into a panicked frenzy, his breathing rapidly beginning to increase. Yagi couldn't help himself as he quickly walked across the room and pulled the crying boy into his arms, silencing his apologies as he gently pushed on the back of Midoriya's head until the boy's chin was resting comfortingly on his shoulder, his own tears quickly coming through as he did so. Midoriya's eyes had widened dramatically with shock as he let out an audible gasp of air at his mentor's actions, silencing his splutters before he felt another overwhelming wave of guilt overcame him. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, All Might. You probably hate me, I'm so sorry." Yagi pulled him further into the hug at his depressing words, whispering words of indisputable comfort and care all the while. "It's all right, Midoriya, it's all right. I'm so sorry," Yagi began, wrapping his other arm around the boy's back as he tugged him closer to settle him. "I didn't see the pain you must have been going through. It's not your fault, young Midoriya, it's not your fault. I don't hate you, I could never hate you." Midoriya freezed in his arms at his word, a silent gasp of air rushing past his ear as the flow of tears continued pouring from their eyes, never once ceasing to stop. Yagi listened carefully to his student in his arms, counting down the seconds until the poor boy slowly got his breath back before relaxing into his arms as he gave up his feeble attempt to escape from his arms. Midoriya lowered his head back into the crook of his mentor's neck as he tried to seek out the comfort of human touch that he had avoided ever since he had been cursed with the power he had never wanted. Grabbing a hold of Yagi's baggy shirt tightly, as if he was going to vanish from his arms, only the comforting palms of his hands holding back the floodgates beneath his eyes. The pair sat like that for a while, not sure how long had passed as both their tears ran empty and dried up, before Yagi slowly opened his mouth to talk to his successor for the first time in a world free from the lies and deception kept hidden between them. "I heard you had asked if you were going to be sent to prison. I can assure you I won't allow that to happen, my boys." Midoriya lowered his head further into his mentor's shirt with a poor hidden cringe, muttering out a few words Yagi had only managed to catch the end off. "I deserve to be thrown in prison." Yagi had almost pulled his head away with shock if it wasn't for the intense grip he felt coming from the boy beside him, as he felt his heart begin to break again at his depressing words. "Oh Midoriya, it's not your fault, you were in a situation where you weren't given a choice." Midoriya slowly shook his head, the movement barely visible as he began to oppose, only to freeze halfway through his words as a terrifying memory struck him. "All Might, I." Yagi tilted his head with concern as he looked down at his student with furrowed eyes, his heart freezing with worry as he saw the suddenly terrified expression crawling on Midoriya's face. "Midoriya, what's wrong? Please tell me?" Midoriya's stiff form slowly lifted away from his neck as he turned to stare his sensei in the eyes, horror glazing them mirroring into Yagis's as they caught his own. "All Might. You were wrong, All for One is still alive." Midoriya began, his words making Yagis's world freeze as he lurched back in shared horror, zoning in on his student's voice and nothing else alone. "He's alive. He tried to take the Ghoul quirk and force me to give him one for all." It was at that moment that Yagi knew he must have been lying to himself, as he felt his heart freeze with horror and disgust, because in that moment he realized he had never felt the true power of rage and hate fuel his body before. He felt his face fold visibly with anger as he tried to keep his tone kind. "Young Midoriya, I'm going to need you to tell me where he is." Midoriya sniffed loudly, his voice shakily weak as he spoke, before leaning back into All Might for another comforting hug. "If I'm allowed to, All Might, I think I could show you." Yagi felt his eyes widen as he felt a wave of urgency overcame him as he interrupted his student's words, swiftly pulling away from his student as he moved his arms to grab a hold of his shoulders to ensure he heard his student's voice clearly. "Midoriya, what do you mean?" Midoriya looked up at Yagi with surprise at his sudden reaction, before awkwardly lowering his head in shame as he hesitated before slowly confessing some of the power behind his cursed abilities. "My sense of smell is strong enough it allows me to follow where people have been." He kept coming into the cell before Bakugo was thrown in with me to try and get. He paused, shaking his head as he looked away slightly before continuing. "I remember what he smells like. If it hasn't rained since we escaped and we go back to the building we escaped, I should be able to find him." Midoriya paused before sighing with a grimace, remembering the warping villain Kurogiri, as he quickly realized a problem they would probably run into. That as long as they haven't teleported away. All Might felt a wave of relief and resolve come over him, his thoughts zoning in on the practical use that Midoriya's quirk would have in possibly taking down the formidable villain, All for One. "Midoriya," Yagi began, quickly replying as he spoke in a serious tone, "I've told you before how dangerous All for One can be, and now you have faced him yourself, but we need to act as quickly as possible to catch him before it's too late." Yagi looked to Midoriya as he stressed his words, his tone and furrowed brows softening slightly as he saw the shock in the boy's eyes at his own desperate response. "I never wanted for you to have to see that despicable man. I want to keep you as far away from him as possible and protect you from him so you never have to see him again, but I'll see what I can do." Midoriya sat back overwhelmed by All Might's worryful words as Yagi sighed and gently released Midoriya from his grip, quickly moving to stand up as he looked back down at his student. "You've been very brave, young Midoriya. I promise that after this is all over, we will talk again, and I will help you in any and every way I can." Midoriya could only nod in silence as Yagi quickly walked out of the room, leaving his student behind as he revealed the grimace hidden beneath his angry face. Fighting All for One was going to be hard, and Yagi was determined to do anything he could to take him down, all the while keeping his successor safe. There wasn't time to make big preparations like with the raid before, they needed to get moving now. Yagi needed to get Midoriya out of the police station as soon as possible so he could take them back to the building he had been tortured in to find the despicable villain. Even if he couldn't get permission in time to take Midoriya out of the station, he wouldn't be against breaking him out to find All on One before taking him out alone. Either way, he knew it was necessary to get Midoriya out of that cell for his own well-being as soon as possible. After all, there was nothing in this world he wouldn't do for his successor's health. The thought alone of taking Midoriya anywhere near that villain left him feeling bitter and disgusted with himself. All Might knew he had a responsibility to take down All for One for the memory of his mentor, the previous holders of One for All and the people of Japan. He could only hope the pressing thought at the back of his mind on whether he would make it back alive to keep his promise wouldn't come true. Thankfully, All Might didn't need to break Midoriya out of his cell, as Gran Torino had walked in and listened to the final part of Midoriya's words after racing to the station after hearing he was safe and sound. With the two heroes combined, it didn't take long for the pair of them to explain the situation to Nezu, along with the confused Aizawa, to convince them that they need to work together to get Midoriya out of the police station, to capture All for One as quickly as possible. As Nezu gave the police and Aizawa a quick rundown of what was going on, Midoriya was giving permission to assist in the mission of capturing All for One, under the conditions that he was to stay beside Gran Torino the entire time and leave the area once the villain was found. The fight between All for One and All Might was broadcast all over the world, the actual battle lasting no more than a few minutes once the first blast attack came. Midoriya had led the two heroes who were available to the worn-down industrial site. He had been kept hostage sniffing the dry air as he did to follow the smell back towards All for One. They had paused on top of a building on the opposite side of the road when Midoriya realized the smell of the rest of the villains who had been here were slowly starting to dwindle away, apart from the one he had killed and All for One who was suspiciously still at the warehouse. They didn't have much time to put it to thought as a loud explosion and rusher air, which freakishly reminded Izuku of the night he was attacked by his old ghoulish friend, came flying full speed towards the trio. Giving Midoriya only a few seconds to think before he was dragged away from the fight by Gran Torino. The pair shot across the sky as they escaped, leaving Midoriya calling out his mentor's name in fear and horror. As they left All Might behind to fight for himself, the battle disappeared into the distance. In the end, All Might won by an inch, his small fragile figure revealed to the world in the process, changing their course of history as they knew it. Yagi managed to win the fight, but All Might, the number one hero, was no more. For now, all that mattered was that All for One was behind bars, 500 feet underground in Tartarus and thousands of miles away from the safety of UA, where Izuku was finally taken to his new home, greeted by overly worried mother who had, much to Izuku's surprise, ran up to him before pulling him into a warm tight hug, as no words were shared apart from their falling tears. In some ways, Izuku had always been more fearful of how his mother was going to react to his ghoulish quirk than All Might. Her presence in his life held up a far more important pillar of support for him over his life. He was just glad his mother did not despise him, even if he senses the hesitance and caution she held back for his sake. Chapter 39. Disgusting food. The UA dorms were implicated a few days after Izuku had been brought to the staff apartments to stay in the meantime, the heroes deciding it would be a better idea for him to stay with Aizawa-sensei to please the officers who would be coming around in the next few days to finish up some details. Thanks to the kind offer Nezu had given his mother, Inko was permitted to stay on the UA site until the first day of the new school term. Staying only a few floors away in a guest apartment which Midoriya would make his way towards along with Aizawa-sensei or an accompanying hero if he was busy each morning. It had come very clear to Izuku that his mother knew of his activities, but never once decided to bring it up to his face, relieving Izuku from the anxiety he felt each day as he made his way to where his mother was staying. Their conversation at first had been awkward and mostly silent as the initial emotions wore off. Izuku had felt so relieved when one day present Mick, who had been accompanying him, gave Izuku the option to give his mother a tour around the school grounds. That was another thing that Midoriya had noticed, living with his teachers for about a week who would constantly visit each other's apartments, that Aizawa-sensei wasn't the only teacher who was surprisingly calm and accepting of his presence in the building, considering the circumstances. As the days drew on that he stayed in Aizawa's guest room, Midnight and Present Mick were common visitors to the apartment, both of whom went out of their way to try and make Izuku enjoy his time there. Even getting him a new phone after his previous one had been destroyed and left during the fight at the training camp. Izuku appreciated their efforts, he really did, but he couldn't help the awkward feelings of shame and distrust overcome him with the undeserved shows of kindness and care that they were showing him, knowing full well that the pair of them knew why he was there in the first place. It wasn't just those two teachers either, who Izuku had learned during their time spent that the pair of them along with Aizawa-sensei had all gone to UA together, but also the rest of the teachers from other departments too. After visiting each area while touring the school with his mother, he couldn't help but feel as if the lot of them had been told to act a certain way in front of him. The constant surveillance and the rules he had to strictly follow certainly did not help as well. Thankfully, Izuku was brought to move into the Class 1 dorms a day or so after the rest of his class had been settled in, and the few students who were aware of Izuku's hidden abilities were notified and warned against revealing any information to the rest of the class, who were being kept out of the loop. He had been given a few minutes to drop off his boxes from Aizawa's room before he was dragged out of the building again, away from Uraraka and Todoroki. who had both wasted no time running up to him to see if he was alright before Aizawa told them to leave him until he had finished sorting out his dorm. Izuku assumed it was probably to avoid the unnecessary drama and accidental info leaks from happening due to his surprise arrival. The two friends both worried out of their minds after hearing no words of his safety after being told that Bakugo and he had both been returned to safety. Izuku quickly realized as he walked back to the school that Bakugo was the only student who wasn't at the dorms yet when he had asked Aizawa-sensei about it. His sensei had only given him a small shake of the head before telling him that Bakugo was busy taking care of something outside of school with his parents, leaving Izuku feeling let down as he walked towards his meeting that All Might had called. Aizawa had escorted him to one of many staff rooms, seeing his mentor the first time he was allowed to see him since the fight at Kamino Ward. All Might had spent the last week busy in the hospital healing from his wounds caused by All for One and meetings with students' parents regarding the UA dormitory system. After Gran Torino had pulled him away from the fearsome battle, he was brought back to the police station he had awoken in, locked in with no internet or TV access, Izuku not even daring to try and break his way out after already being proved innocent once. Izuku had spent the rest of the night crying, paranoid about whether he had taken All Might to his death, not knowing whether he had survived until Aizawa told him after rescuing him from his cell once again. Just after overhearing a rather loud argument beyond the locked door between his sensei and the police officer who had pushed him back in the cell. In the car back to UA, Aizawa had kindly offered his phone for him to look up and see what had happened the night before. Only to discover All Might's true form and injuries visible for the whole world to see, leaving Izuku gasping shock as tears had rolled down his face while he watched the clips, which had already been uploaded hundreds of thousands of times. "Hey, young Midoriya." A voice called out softly, "Your coffee is getting cold." His mentor's voice pulled him from his train of thoughts as he let out a stuttered "oh" before picking up and taking a sip, ignoring the worried, furrow-browed look his bandaged-up mentor was giving him. "Midoriya? Are you alright?" "I'm sorry, All Might. I truly am," Izuku began, lowering his head as he trained his eye around the cup of tea in his hand, looking at his reflection in the darkened liquid. All Might raised his eyebrows before furrowing them worriedly again, letting out a sigh as he spoke. "Midoriya, I've told you before, it's alright." Izuku shook his head, lifting one of his hands to rub the side of his face before looking up to his mentor with a weary gaze. I know, he repeated softly, "but I want you to know how truly sorry I am for keeping it all a secret from you." Midoriya watched as Yagi widened his eyes slightly, listening to his successor apologize again in a more formal manner than before, while nodding silently as he let him continue. "I should have told you and asked for help, I realize that now." Izuku started again, looking down at his hands. "It was stupid of me to keep it a secret for so long, to try and deal with such a problem on my own." He paused momentarily as he sighed. "I'm sorry for putting you under so much stress, I'm sorry for making the people around me doubt my intentions. I feel horrible for dragging my friends into it when they shouldn't have had to have dealt with it in the first place." Yagi nodded subtly, lifting his drink to his lips to take a sip before placing it down. "I know, Midoriya. I know what you did in the past was what you thought was best, and I don't blame you for any of it. You've said it before, my boy, but I'll accept your apology anyway." Yagi started, knowing that denying his apology wouldn't help Midoriya feel any better about himself. Izuku nodded as he let out a shaken sigh of relief, lifting his coffee to drink it as he tried to settle his nerves. The 2-1-for-all users sat in peaceful silence for a while before Izuku managed to gain some of his confidence back. "I wasn't joking about how I know I deserve to go to prison, I'm honestly still surprised I'm allowed to walk around UA still." Yagi gave a little wince at his student's words, sipping at his tea before taking a deep breath as he replied. "I think if you had been any older and hadn't been a student of UA or my successor, you probably would have been the case." Yagi began, "Unfortunately, there are still a lot of people who think it would be better for you to be somewhere like Tartarus, but that's not going to happen. You would be in more danger of villains, and All for One, there than you are here." Yagi lowered his cup onto his saucer, sighing as he silently saw Midoriya's face crumple with a grimace of shame. "Midoriya, I would never let anyone take you away to a prison, my boy." Yagi began with a caring smile, shifting forward in his seat as he rested a comforting hand on Izuku's shoulder. "You just helped us catch the most notorious supervillain of all time. Without you, he would still be out on the run, causing more havoc and misery down his path." Besides, it would be unwise to place you in a jail closer to him where you can't escape if necessary. Izuku tried and failed to hold back a wince as he looked down shamefully to the floor of All Might admittance to the group of people who didn't want him to walk free, understanding deep down why so many people would be against his freedom. He rubbed his green eyes tiredly as he watched the steam coming from All Might's tea, not feeling strong enough to bring himself to look his mentor in the face as he remained deep in thought. Now was the best time to tell him, right? Izuku took in a quick shaken breath, attracting his mentor's attention, hesitating for only a moment before he spoke. I was planning on giving one for all back to you, or giving it to someone else I trusted, but I couldn't decide who. Izuku quickly confessed, face still tight with a grimace as he rubbed his eyes. Yagi watched his successor worriedly, his eyes widening a little at the prospect of Izuku considering giving one for all away. It's alright, Midoriya. Please don't worry about giving one for all back to me. Izuku looked up at his mentor with widened eyes, shocked and somewhat disgusted that All Might could still want him, a murderer, to keep one for all. But why would you still want me to have it? After everything that I did? Yagi paused as Isaac's desperate words interrupted him, looking at his panicked successor troubledly. The only thing I wish you had done was come and speak to me sooner, but that couldn't be helped, and I don't blame you for not asking me for help, but I know I choose right with who I wanted my successor to be. I chose you before you even had your Ghoul quirk. He paused as he watched Izuku gape silently. Midoriya, you still have the heart of a hero, I truly believe that. I doubt you would have aided Bakugo in your escape if you didn't. Yagi continued, lifting his teacup to his lips once again as he took another drink before lowering his caring tone to something more serious. Besides, if you didn't have one for all for one would have stolen the quirk and gained the insane healing abilities, speed, and power you possess along with it. Yagi looked down from Midoriya's stunned face with a sigh. I'll be honest, young Midoriya, the fight we shared had been a rather close call. All for one was still missing his eyesight and hearing from our previous battles. I'm not too sure I would have survived our battle if he had managed to regenerate those horrific wounds. Thankfully, regeneration quirks that hold the same level of power as your own are exceedingly rare. Izuku nodded his head silently, lowering his head in shame as he remembered the close call he had, almost giving away one for all to Bakugo. All Might, I have something else to tell you that's been troubling me with one for all. Izuku began quietly, leaving Yagi nodding as he prompted him to continue. Izuku took in a deep breath before sighing as he fiddled with his fingers. When I started heroic lessons here, I realized how one for all was affecting how much I needed to eat, from constantly having to re-heal myself from injuries. It's been increasing the power outage I've been having to use, which is why I had to start eating more. His words trailed off guilty at the end as he looked away from his mentor, tears dripping slowly from his eyes as he quickly rushed to wipe them away. All Might furrowed his brows worriedly before nodding understandingly. I see, my boy, please don't be ashamed. I promise we will find a way to change that for you. You've already been told you've been pulled from heroic lessons, haven't you? Izuku nodded sadly in agreement. Yay, Aizawa told me when he was telling me about all the new rules I have to follow. Yagi held back a small grimace at the reminder. I see. The pair sat in silence for a little longer, occasionally sharing a few bits of information before Izuku quickly remembered something, causing him to sit up slightly as he muttered a little to himself. Yagi looked at him questioningly, prompting him to talk. Oh, sorry, I just remembered something I should tell you. Izuku began, rubbing the back of his head awkwardly. I told Kaken about one for all while we were both being held hostage together. All Might's eyes widened with surprise as Izuku continued. He had started to get angry with me. He knew I had been quirkless in middle school, and I guess he wanted answers about where I managed to pull 2 quirks from. Izuku began softly, rubbing the weariness from his eyes. I was just so tired and exhausted from all for one. He cut himself off with a sudden shake of the head, shoving the thoughts of the traumatic pain away. I was just so stressed out once I heard the villains coming down to open the door just before we had escaped. I had thought it was all for one and I just panicked. Izuku grabbed the sides of his face with his hands as he took a deep breath. I had been thinking of giving it away to someone else not long before, and the possibilities of going through the pain again was getting too much for me. I must have looked like a hysterical mess, but Kaken never gave in and took it from me. All Might looked at his student with concern, leaning forward in his seat to comfort his anxiety-ridden student. I trust your decision to tell Bakugo about one for all, but Midoriya, do you genuinely not want to have one for all anymore? Izuku shook his head. I really don't know anymore. I mean, I still really want to be a hero, but… If you still want to be a hero, then please, keep it. Yagi interrupted, cutting Izuku off. As long as the effects it has over your ghoul quirk don't get any worse, I don't see a reason why you shouldn't hold on to it for me. Yagi offered Midoriya a kind smile. I chose you to succeed me with one for all for a reason. The fact you still have one for all after all this time is very commendable, reinforcing my decision that I choose correctly. Izuku looked back up at his mentor with surprise. Oh, okay, he stuttered, nodding silently just as the office door opened. The two one-for-all users looked towards the door as they saw Nezu standing upon the detective's shoulder, the same man he had assumed had the truth quirk during his interrogations. As he walked into the room, All Might stood up from his seat, quickly placing his tea down to greet the two men. Hello, Principal, Tsukauchi, he began with a bow, Izuku nervously jumping up from his seat behind, where All Might stood as he greeted them as well. Nezu smiled at the greeting as he looked between the two one-for-all users. Hello, Yagi-san, Midoriya-kun. I'm sorry for interrupting your meeting at such short notice, however, I was wondering if Midoriya here could answer me a few questions about something that's been bugging me for an answer. Izuku looked nervously at the detective and his principal as he felt his body tense, subconsciously shifting behind where All Might stood between them. It was clear that Yagi knew where Nezu was going as he grimaced and turned to look towards his successor, not sure about what to say. Thankfully, Tsukauchi managed to settle some of the tension as he offered Midoriya a kind, genuine smile. It's all right, Midoriya, please try not to worry. We're just here to ask you about where you had been sourcing your food during the 2 months before the training camp took place. The detective started softly. We've already asked you friends about this before, and even though they didn't give us an answer, we believe their judgment enough not to suspect you of any foul play. Izuku hesitated to respond as he looked between the trio of men in the room, eyes whitening as he realized where this was going, gulping awkwardly as he tried to quickly think up a way to protect Kaneki's identity without setting off the detective's truth quirk. I met someone with a regeneration quirk who offered to help me. Izuku began, Tsukauchi quickly nodding as he noted something down in his notebook. Nezu looked from the detective's notes over his shoulder quickly before turning to Izuku with a smile, pushing for more information, not noticing Izuku's growing discomfort. That must have been some fortunate luck for you, Midoriya. Nezu began, his tone unreadable. May I just ask how the two of you met? Izuku gulped nervously, feeling utterly uncomfortable talking about his disgusting eating habits in front of his mentor, trying to think of a way to describe how he and Hyde had met. Yagi reached out and ruffled Izuku's hair softly as he mistook his hesitancy for anxiety, bringing Izuku from his thoughts. Oh well, we met through a friend I met outside of school. Nezu nodded his head understandingly, Tsukauchi quickly noting something down again. Alright, I've just one last question for you. I've been curious about why you attacked the homeless man, while the rest of your targets have been either villains or already deceased bodies. Nezu. Yagi turned to Nezu warningly, the dark sunken eyes of the hero narrowing, as Izuku grimaced behind him at the principal's blunt and insensitive words. I hadn't known at the time that I had the ghoul quirk in me, I had only just gotten out of the hospital, Izuku muttered out awkwardly from behind All Might, who was looking with surprise at him for responding at all. Nezu nodded his head intriguingly, prompting Izuku to continue with an exhaustive sigh, fiddling with his fingers as his face crumpled with an anxious grimace. I just remember slowly getting more hungry during the day, and normal food just suddenly starting tasting gross. Izuku continued quietly, turning in All Might direction as he spoke, lowering his head as he began to feel disgusted with himself. I was just walking home from the beach after I had gone out to meet with you, just after I had gotten out of the hospital when I smelt blood. I hadn't known it was blood at the time, and I came across someone's dead body. The room stayed silent as Izuku felt his body begin to shake a little. The overwhelming pressure he had placed on himself to confess and always be honest about himself and his abilities clearly started to stress him. I hadn't known it was blood, I had followed it, and I came across someone. Tears began to well up in his eyes while he took a deep breath to try and settle his nerves. I ran straight home and went into the bathroom to throw up when I caught my eye in the mirror. I don't remember what happened after, I was just so hungry. Izuku dragged in a shaken breath. I told the guy to leave me alone, but I lost control. Yagi stopped Izuku mid-sentence, pulling the boy into a hug before it became too much for him. It's alright, we understand, Midoriya, you can stop now. He patted the poor boy on the head before pulling away, leaving the teary Izuku feeling vulnerable under the adult's eyes surrounding him, not noticing the grimace shared on their faces as he looked down to the floor. "Alright then, that will be enough for now. I apologize if I offended you or made you feel uneasy, Midoriya." Nezu began with his usual, slightly unnerving smile, as Izuku quickly shook his head in response. "I'm sure you have already realized, but you won't be able to use your friend's abilities as a food source anymore. With your new food plan in place, we need to keep track of everything you eat and do, while we try to find a more sustainable food source that will allow you to participate in hero course lessons again." Izuku nodded numbly, his emotions flying through him to exhaustion, leaving him feeling awful and alone. He didn't need to be told he couldn't ask Hyde for food anymore. He'd never wanted to use him like that, just like he'd never wanted to kill someone, but unfortunately back then he hadn't had the choice to opt for something more ethical. He had thought once he had been told that he would be going back to UA, that he would finally be able to feel happy without the looming secrets above his head. Of course, there would have still been the wariness he held towards the staff members, but he hadn't felt better at all. In some ways, being back at school surrounded by his classmates, he felt more isolated than before. He still had Uraraka and Todoroki, and he assumed Bakugo would be alright with him once they saw each other again, but he hadn't spoken to Iida since before the training camp. After the conversation with Nezu, the detective and all might be over, Nezu asked if he could contact Hyde to invite him to UA to inform him of Isaac's new diet plan, and secretly for Nisa's own curiosity. It had taken a while for Izuku to get a hold of Hyde's phone number again, not having spoken Hyde or Kaneki since before the summer training camp. Losing both of their numbers off his old phone, which turned up to be useless when it came to transferring information over to the new one Midnight had given him. Thankfully, with a quick trip back to the door, escorted by All Might, he had managed to get the number off Uraraka's phone. The phone call had lasted longer than he had expected, Hyde much more enthusiastic to see him than Izuku had expected, although his enthusiasm died a little once he had explained the situation to him, understanding the seriousness of it all. He hadn't known at the time that Kaneki had been sitting beside him listening to their whole conversation, grimacing at the thought of the principal of UA being on their case. Izuku couldn't have brought Kaneki up over the phone nor ask how he was doing, for obvious reasons, but thankfully Hyde had confirmed that he was alright, without mentioning his name at all during his time at UA, after his arrival to the school the same day. Aizawa had escorted him into the building once Izuku had confirmed his identity, leading them to a small office where Nezu spoke to the pair of them. Hyde had been more than understanding, treating the meeting as if it was some kind of parent-child conference when it came to talking about Izuku's food and privacy and safety while eating, much to the surprise of Izuku and his teachers. He hadn't expected Hyde to stick himself so far in his corner while dealing with the principal of UA, although it made sense after a while. It would look suspicious if he didn't. Hyde was probably trying to protect him from getting accused of forcing him. After a quick, slightly altered yet still true version of how Hyde discovered his quirk, he made an offer to Nezu and the few other teachers in the room. "I'd be more than happy to help with making sure Izuku has enough food. I don't like the idea of him running around attacking villains again," Hyde had offered with a kind smile. Nezu shook his head in response. "I appreciate your offer, however, it won't be necessary. We have already got Midoriya on a plan while we try to find a suitable alternative in the meantime, which will allow him to continue in his studies under supervision." Izuku could almost see the gears turning in Hyde's head as Nezu continued describing their plan to try and make an ethical food source for him, stars almost glistening in his eyes at the possibilities. Once Nezu had finished talking, Hyde's eyes closed with a wide smile at his words. "That sounds great. Would it be okay if you kept me up to date with your progress? It sounds rather interesting." Nezu stayed silent for a moment, clearing deep in thought as he looked at Hyde, seemingly trying to figure out if Hyde's words were genuine, setting Izuku on edge. He didn't want Kaneki to get revealed in the middle of this. Izuku knew how intelligent Nezu was, and even though Hyde was also very clever, Izuku wouldn't put it past Nezu to do background checks on their friends and the friend they had met each other through. Much to Izuku's relief, Kanekis's name was kept hidden and unsaid from speculation, as Hyde left not long after arriving, leaving Izuku behind to return to his dorm room, wondering how Bakugo was going to react to seeing him the next day. Chapter 40. The few we once called friends. The sun had just started to set by the time Izuku got back to the dorms, shuffling his feet through the doors silently as All Might, who had escorted him back, followed him through the doors. His classmates had just begun to settle for the evening, creating a pillow fort in the living room, with sounds of joy radiating throughout the room, and dishes of food laying spread out over the kitchen table just out of view. Izuku felt his expression soften at the sight, momentarily forgetting the anxiety which had been building as he had walked to the dorms, watching his classmates silently as they ran about grabbing stuff for their movie night, all with smiles attached to their faces. The entire atmosphere around the room had lifted Izuku's dull spirits, making him almost forget they hadn't noticed he was there when the sounds of the dorm front door shutting behind them grabbed a few of his classmates' attention. The instant's reaction at noticing his presence varied widely between people, for better or for worse. Deku-kun. A loud excited squeal from over the other side of the living room as Ochako bolted towards him before pulling him into a tight hug around his waist, the sudden action catching him by surprise. Izuku jumped back slightly at her action, a little unsure as to what to do as he tensed up at the unfamiliar contact, before gently placing his arms around her body to return the hug, offhandedly ignoring the embarrassed flush he could feel warming upon his cheeks. Ochako looked up from where she had been squeezing him and offered him a wide smile before quickly tightening her hold and letting go to grab a hold of his hands to get a good look at him. "Oh, I'm so glad you're all right." She began with a bubbly grin, her personality radiating like waves around her, making Izuku smile awkwardly, just as another voice joined the pair of them. "Midoriya." Todoroki was quick to join their side, his smile much smaller and still just as comforting as Ochako's, as some of the other members of their class began to circle the trio of them. As the smiles and voices filled with joy surrounded him, it didn't take long for him to notice the stark contrast between the people watching silently behind. Mineta, who Izuku remembered seeing at the training camp along with Iida, Kuta, and Ajiro while he was in his ghoul form, froze as their eyes made contact. The cold, terrified look he was sent made Izuku's heart drop as he saw the muted fear behind his classmates' eyes, the poor boy physically shivering at his presence. Something in him felt odd, watching someone he never really considered a friend, but a classmate nonetheless, murmuring something to a tense-looking Tokoyami who was standing beside Shoji before quickly scampering away from him. Izuku gulped as he felt the smile on his cheeks tighten, his eyes training in on the rest of the few others hanging back silently from the crowd, subconsciously blocking out the noise from the frequent question and discussion happening right beside him. Tokoyami and Shoji stood awkwardly at the edge of the kitchen, watching from afar, the looks of unsure distrust and mild displeasure as they shared a knowing look together. The two boys had both been with their small group when both he and Bakugo had been kidnapped, both of them sharing the same memories of him tearing the Nomu apart to its death as he lost control over his body. Izuku hadn't had the chance to talk to them yet to try and explain why, but he didn't think it would be worth trying to defend his actions, seeing the lingering looks of fear and tension which filtered between them. Kuta and Ajiro weren't much different than the others, both holding back as they stared at him with shock and betrayal, as they made no attempts to get anywhere closer towards him, although Midoriya could see the tinge of sadness in Ajiro's expression. It only took him a second to remember that Aizawa had told him that the rest of the class had been told Hagakure had dropped out of her free will, and not because she was a traitor to the school. It wouldn't surprise him if the few people who knew of his identity didn't start coming up with their own theories as to why he had been allowed back into the school so freely, wondering what kinds of dodgy deals or lies he must have told to bribe his way back in. It wouldn't take them long to speculate that he could have been the traitor all along instead. None of it was true, of course, but they didn't know that. None of them had a clue. The last person Izuku made eye contact with was Iida, who was busying himself away at the edge of the kitchen, trying to stay out of his line of sight. Izuku felt his stomach twist uncomfortably as they made momentary eye contact, his friend grimacing silently before looking away from him, not bothering to give him the dirty looks the others had given him. Izuku had expected something worse. He had expected him to say something crude, for him to send him distrustful glares, or to scamper away in fear much like Mineta had done. It hurt to know one of the few close friends he had made during his time at UA wanted nothing to do with him anymore, reminding him of the horrible days which followed after his quirklessness diagnosis, and in some way, Iida's distant reaction made him feel so much worse. "Deku, are you alright?" Izuku jumped slightly as he looked back towards Ochako, who was looking at him with worry, her curiosity getting the best of her as she followed his line of sight and let out an understanding "ew." The rest of the class seemed to have wandered off by now, going back to preparing for their movie night and offering him offhanded invitations to join them, with only Shoto standing by his side still when Izuku replied to her. I'm fine, Uraraka, it's alright. Izuku began, lowering his head so none of his oblivious classmates would overhear them. I don't blame them for acting that way. Uraraka shifted slightly as his expression tightened, the pair now looking face to face as she rebuked his statement, but it's not your fault, you shouldn't have to put up with that. Izuku grimaced. They don't know what happened, Uraraka. He began, shaking his head slightly. They have every right to be afraid after what they saw, and knowing who I am. Not everyone was as kind and as understanding as Uraraka and Todoroki had been to him, evident by the masses of people who had been working on his case and still fought against his freedom, even after they had all heard the truth spilling from his mouth. Even after all this time, Izuku was still surprised at the kindness and care the staff at UA were showing him, and the lengths they had gone to ensure his safety. This included the acceptance Uraraka and Todoroki had shown him, even though they had both been furious and utterly disgusted with him before he had poured his heart out to them and showed them his weakest points. Izuku wouldn't be surprised if both of them had been terrified of him, even after he had managed to explain himself. He knew the looks of doubt and distrust they must send behind his back. It's natural to be scared and hate the things you don't understand, after all. Uraraka watched him silently before sighing and offering him a weak smile, nodding solemnly as she pulled away from their close proximity. She stood back and scratched her arm as she looked over to Iida when Izuku overheard her let out a sharp gasp, her nail catching on a massive scar on her arm, which had gone hidden out of sight by her sleeve until she had brought attention to it. Izuku felt his eyes widen with horror at the sight, the mangled scar tissue hitting Izuku like a freight train, as he instantly recognized where the wound had come from. The ghastly scar stretched from her forearm before reaching up to her shoulder where skin grafts and surgery scars clearly laid, evidence of the extreme procedures the doctors who had treated her had to take to salvage her arm. Uraraka, you arm. Izuku's voice was strained, his heart dropping and smashing on the ground as he felt a sharp wave of guilt and shame overcome him. Achako sucked in a deep breath as she pulled her hand away from her arm, her body tensing rigidly, while realizing what he was talking about before she had even turned back to face him. It's nothing. Her words came out frantically, eye widening with urgency as she quickly turned back to face Izuku, as if she had been caught doing something illegal, nervously looking enough the room to see if anyone was still watching them. Other than Todoroki, who was standing back with concern written on his face. Quickly she swiped her hand away from her arm and patted her sleeve back down, in some kind of futile attempt to hide it away, the end of the scar still poking out as she desperately tried to hide its extent from Aizawa's view. Izuku's face crumpled with shame and fearful disgust towards himself, eyebrows furrowing worriedly as his mouth opened to rebuke her statement. Uraraka, that's not fine, She said it was nothing, Deku. The pair both stopped as they peered over to where Bakugo had appeared, his eyes and brows narrow as always as he walked casually toward them, so stop thinking about it. Izuku felt his eyes widen with surprise, looking away from Uraraka, who moved away from him as his attention settled on his friend, the words of relief he felt falling from his mouth after finally seeing him again after the traumatic experiences they had shared together. Kaken. You're all right. Bakugo looked him up and down, his eyes lingering on his healed leg and the partly hidden scars under his long-sleeved shirt, reminding Izuku with a blanched grimace of the last time they had seen each other, just after he had torn his own leg off, been knocked unconscious. Handcuffed and dragged inside the police station. It hadn't particularly been the greatest farewell interaction. At least, however, Bakugo didn't look much worse for wear considering what they had been through. Although, Izuku was sure he could still see the faint outline of darkened under eyes hanging onto his skin. Bakugo rolled his eyes slightly as he clicked his tongue. Stop the crying, Deku, I didn't come down here to hear you whining. He momentarily paused, shifting on his feet as his expression softened. No one told me if you were coming back, I was gonna get really pissed off if you didn't. Izuku looked at Bakugo with surprise, his jaw dropping slightly at his words, while Achako and Shoto stood back and watched with a similar response. The pair stood in silence for a bit, no one really knowing what to say until Izuku began to utter an awkward response. Oh hey. Bakubro? Have you finished your room? Izuku jumped slightly as Kirishima came dashing over with a bright grin on his face, clearly unaware of what they were talking about, as he saved the pair from shared second-hand embarrassment. Bakugo turned to face his friend as Kirishima finally came to a stop beside them, giving Uraraka a chance to slip away with Todoroki, following closely behind from the conversation that Izuku and Bakugo had been dragged into, much to Izuku's low-spirited guilt. "Yay, I've nearly finished now, I can do the rest later." Bakugo began, far calmer than Izuku was used to hearing him speak. Kirishima nodded quickly with a bright smile, balling his hands into fists excitedly, the little reaction causing Izuku's frown to lighten slightly at the sight. "All right. Finally, we can all spend time together again." Kirishima cheered with his eyes closed joyfully, opening them again to ask him a question. "Are you coming down for movie night?" "You too, Midoriya. I don't think you heard me earlier. We've almost finished setting up but." Bakugo shifted slightly as he uncharacteristically cut in. "I need to talk to Deku about something." Kirishima paused for a moment, his hands still clenched in happy fists as he looked between the two, worry growing on his expression at Bakugo's awkwardly quiet response. "Oh. Is this about?" Kirishima paused before wincing and offering them a sympathetic look. Bakugo only remained silent, rolling his head to the side to look out the window as Izuku looked between the two, wondering what Bakugo wanted to say to him. Probably relating to the mess Izuku had brought him into, that would probably be about right. Kirishima offered them a weak smile and took his silence as an answer, nodding his head with understanding. "All right then, we're all just happy you're both all right, you know." He began much more calmly, tilting his head to the side as he smiled brightly again. "You're both welcome to join us once you are done. We were all really worried about you. You must have had to have been super manly to escape, so you don't have to be ashamed and hide away from us because of what happened." His oblivious words struck a chord in Izuku as he offered Kirishima a wobbly smile as he tried to hold back his tears, knowing Kirishima wouldn't be saying the same things if he had known what some of the others had seen. "Ah, thanks Kirishima," Izuku replied, Bakugo watching him silently before sighing and turning away to walk back to the elevator. "Come on, nerd." Izuku looked over to the elevator before offering Kirishima a quick smile before jogging over to Bakugo to join him, the pair leaving the rest of the students in the common room, feeling utterly relieved for either their safe return home or Izuku's final absence from the room. Bakugo's calm exterior seemed to switch off the moment the elevator doors shut behind them, the fade covering his true anger and annoyance towards Izuku disappearing as they silently went to Bakugo's dorm, since Izuku had yet been given time to finish unpacking all his stuff. Leaving Izuku in a tense position as the blonde opening the door to his room prompted Izuku to follow. The lights were left off as the sun shone brightly through the window, layering the room in a cover of golden light as they slowly trodden their way into the room. Silence. Izuku stood near the entrance of the room as he shut the door behind him in silence, unsure of what to do as Bakugo seemed to get more agitated and annoyed at something as each second ticked on. Izuku gulped awkwardly, Kaken? If this is about he paused, what happened? I'm sorry, Bakugo seethed through his teeth before letting out an agitated sigh as he clenched his fist, interrupting Izuku's speech. Izuku stood back as he watched the blonde look down to his hands before Bakugo turned to look back up at him for the first time since they had both been downstairs. His eyes were greeted by the narrowed red iris of Bakugo's own. The sight caused him to flinch back slightly at their intensity, the sight bringing him back to their days in middle school, Izuku's reactions leaving Bakugo hesitating and shifting awkwardly as guilt crept into the blonde's body. I need to know." Bakugo began with a struggle, pulling his eyes away from Izakus as he gritted his teeth with a wave of bitter anger towards himself and Izuku. Izuku took a cautious step back when Bakugo noticed his action and turned to look at him, the expression now caught in the blonde's eyes, making his whole world pause at the absurdity of it all. Was he crying? The tears weren't there for long, as Bakugo quickly wiped them away, but Izuku had known what he had seen reflexing in the poor light. He reached out his hand. "Kaken, Bakugo flinched. "Why didn't you attack me?" "Ha, Deku? Why didn't you try and eat me?" Izuku flinched back in horror at Katsuka's painful words, the spiteful tone drilling into his mind before he narrowed his eyes at the audacity of that man. What?" Izuku questioned offendedly, a look of disgust and sorrow forming on his face at the thought of Bakugo thinking so lowly of him after everything they had been through. "Why would you even say that? You're my friend, I would never hurt you." His answer only seemed to irritate Bakugo more. "That's not what I meant. You stupid moron." He growled angrily, curses and swears flying wildly. "Why did you risk your escape like that to help me?" "Ha. I didn't. It was Midoriya's turn to narrow his eyes spitefully as he assumed Bakugo's ego was getting the best over him just like it always had. Are you seriously getting angry at me because I helped you get out of that warehouse? Izuku raised his voice as he folded his arms with an agitated sigh, not having the energy to care about the consequences of his back-mouthing now. Really? You're getting petty over that? No. Izuku blinked as Bakugo interrupted him with a sharp response, grabbing at his blonde hair stressfully as he muttered something incoherent to himself. Why can't you just understand? Izuku felt his arm loosen as he watched Bakugo harshly pulled at his hair. Kaken? What's wrong? His words were cut off once again, but this time by Bakugo's strained laugh, causing Izuku to flinch back slightly whilst looking at him with concern. Kaken? Why are you like this to me? After everything I've done and how horrible I've been to you our entire lives. And suddenly, Midoriya realized what he was talking about. Kaken. And stop calling me that stupid nickname. I don't get it. I don't get you. Isaacus's narrowed eyes softened into something more like a wince as he clenched his mouth shut. I don't know why I don't hate you, after how horrible you've been to me in the past. He paused before sighing and lowering. I've just had some kind of urge to follow you wherever you go, ever since we were young. Even though I've had far too much on my own plate to bother you since I was given my quirks. The sun began to hide itself behind the curve of the earth as exhaustion dragged at his body from the long day he had had to endure, the tension draining out as he slumped slightly without care. But why would you bother putting up with that, you stupid nerd? Izuku stifled a tired sigh, taking a deep breath in as he spoke, offering Bakugo a weak smile. I'm not stupid enough not to realize we haven't been close friends in a very long time, Kaken. He began softly, his words catching Bakugo by surprise as he turned to face him again. That doesn't mean I stopped caring about you as if you were. Even when the sludge monster had attacked you, and I didn't have a quirk, I could just stand by and watch you die. Bakugo shifted, the anger on his face replaced with something far more muted as he looked at Izuku tiredly, turning to look away. That doesn't explain why you would go so far to eat your own fingers over and over again, does it, Deku? You threw yourself in front of every attack that the League had sent at us like a reckless idiot, even though you were starving. Izuku winced at his blunt words, opening his mouth to respond when Bakugo carried on, grabbing at his hair as he slid his hands down his face. Ever since we escaped, I can't stop myself from thinking back to when Shigaraki disintegrated your leg. I can't stop thinking about how you just tore your own leg off to stop the damage from spreading, and there was nothing I could have done to help. Bakugo drew in a long shaken breath, his eyes hardening defensively, while the tears trailing down his face, clearly visible to Izuku, told a different story. Am I really that I felt so useless? I couldn't have escaped there on my own, there was no way I could have used my quirk either to protect myself, and yet I got out unscathed. Was Bakugo behaving like this because he couldn't make sense of why Izuku hadn't eaten him? The thought made Izuku feel sick, his stomach swirling at the thought of murdering someone he had known for so long. Bakugo might have been an asshole to him, well, he still was, but Izuku would fight against his hunger to the very end if it meant he could keep someone he cared about alive. As much as I would never want to eat you anyway, I don't think I could live with myself if I ate someone I had known personally for such a long time, intentionally or not. Izuku mumbled out, thinking back on all the pale, lifeless faces he had watched the warm drain from, causing Bakugo's eyes to whiten uncharacteristically at his response. He thought back to the darkroom they had been caged in, the blood, the tears and the mold which riddled the walls, causing Izuku to shift under his classmates' watch awkwardly. Bakugo was right, there was no point in trying to deny it. He had been starving, even before they had been thrown in together. Izuku snorted softly, suddenly remembering something, as a sad smile formed on his face. He looked towards Bakugo with a small playful grin, the latter looking at him weirdly at his odd reaction. I won't lie though, Izuku began with a quiet laugh, your quick makes you smell of caramel anyway, and I can't stand the smell of it, you probably wouldn't taste very good at all. Bakugo's surprised expression quickly morphed into a scowl, wiping away some of the few tears which had escaped from his eyes as Midoriya chuckled lightly at his reaction. The pair stood in a calming silence, neither really knowing how to respond as they both soaked in the last remaining flares of the sun. A minute had ticked by, and Izuku shifted slowly towards Bakugo, raising his arms, offering him a silent hug with a weary grin on his face. We can be friends now though, right? Bakugo turned to look at him suspiciously, eyeing Izuku's hands before letting out a long sigh, turning to face Izuku as he grumbled out a response. Fine. Just this time. Midoriya wasn't sure if he was replying to his offer of friendship or a hug, but either way, it didn't matter as he walked forward and pulled Bakugo into a hug, the latter keeping his arms locked to his sides as Izuku wrapped his arms around his and soaked up the comfort. It felt really odd, to him at least, finally hugging his longest friend for the first time since they were probably just around 3, but it was nice, the physical contact warming Izuku's tired soul. It wasn't long until Izuku felt Bakugo's arms hesitantly move up to hug at the green-haired boy's waist, the blonde hiding his face from Izuku behind his wavy hair. The sun dropped from the sky, leaving behind the golden haze in the sky as it slowly followed beyond the horizon. Izuku didn't know it at the time, but the physical contact calmed the raging waves inside Bakugo's mind, the touch reminding him that Midoriya was going to be alright and that he was safe and alive. Reminding him that they were both safe and alive. Midoriya would say that the shouts and threats about trying to blackmail his friend that he received later were certainly worth it.